YouTube, please go follow me on YouTube. I'm actually live as we speak on YouTube. So if you guys want to be able to go watch me on YouTube, go check it out. YouTube, I'm live on TikTok. I'm dual live, so that way we'll be able to get double the participation and double the consumption of knowledge, right? So today, with the New Ever Young Lord Book Club, also known as AfroTaino Book Club, we're going over War Against All Puerto Ricans by Nelson Dennis. This is new to YouTube and not to TikTok. So what I like to do is bring education. So I believe in socialism, free education, free housing, and free healthcare. For TikTok and YouTube, tap the screen, share this live so we could be able to share the message and show a little bit of socialist love to the community. If this is a lot of your first time on YouTube. But TikTok, again, we will be going down to Puerto Rico from October 6th to the 15th at the Marco Sanchez Community Center. We are looking for donations. You can check the donations. Link is in the bio. All gifts and donations on both platforms, YouTube and TikTok, will be going to the Young Lords Back to Borinquen project that we're going to in October. But without further ado, I want to start off the book, guys. So let's get right into it.
This is Audible.
Yeah, we're listening to Audible.
Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents War Against All Puerto Ricans, Revolution and Terror in America's Colony, by Nelson A. Dennis. Narrated by Peter Burkrot. There will be war to the death against all Puerto Ricans. E. Francis Riggs, Chief of Police of Puerto Rico. They were conquerors. They grabbed what they could get for the sake of what was to be got. It was just robbery with violence, aggravated murder on a grand scale. The conquest of the earth, which mostly means the taking it away from those who have a different complexion or slightly flatter noses than ourselves, is not a pretty thing when you look into it too much. Joseph Conrad, Art of Darkness. Preface. My mother was Puerto Rican. My father was Cuban. They worked very hard, and we lived in a small but spotless apartment in New York City's Washington Heights. I was 8 years old when men from the FBI banged on our door at 3 a.m. No one understood what was happening. My mother screamed, my grandmother cried, and I hid behind a curtain. The FBI agents grabbed my father and took him away. We never saw him again. It was October 1962, the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and someone had denounced my father as a spy. There was no trial or administrative hearing, no evidence or due process. He was simply deported to Cuba. A few months later, in June 1963, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy received his annual Immigration and Naturalization Service report, which stated, investigation of Cuban refugees increased during this year. Under this pressure, a number of Cubans alleged to be subversive departed prior to the completion of the investigations. These included Antonio Dennis Jordan, suspected Cuban G2 agent in New York City. My father was an elevator operator and a member of the Janitors Union, 32BJ-SEIU. He supported the Cuban Revolution and spoke in favor of it during the late 1950s. He even read Bohemia, a leftist magazine, and showed me the 1959 Bohemia of Freedom issue, with its gruesome photos of bodies massacred by Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. He was a Cuban patriot, but he was not a spy. This didn't matter to the United States, which never allowed him to return. My mother raised me by herself, working in belt factories for $50 a week. And I vowed to become a lawyer, so that no one would knock on our door again and rip our family apart. As a Harvard undergraduate, I noticed a strange thing in Widener Library. It had 57 miles of shelves and 3 million books, but the 1973 card catalog contained not even a single volume about Pedro Albizu Campos, the principal figure in Puerto Rican political history. I responded with my own scholarship, a study of the fraudulent Constitution of Puerto Rico, which became the cover story for the 1977 Harvard Political Review. Over the subsequent 40 years, I have continued to research the life and death of Albizu Campos. I visited my family in Puerto Rico dozens of times, particularly in Caguas, where they helped me meet members of the Nationalist Party, a political organization deeply committed to Puerto Rican independence. Some of these nationalists served time with Albizu in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Others were imprisoned with him in La Princesa, a prison in San Juan. Still others were tortured in Aguadilla. All of them had vivid memories of El Maestro, the teacher, and the revolution he ignited. I wasn't writing a book yet. I was recovering my own past and understanding certain quirks in the Puerto Rican personality. For example, we see so many huge, surrealistic flags during the New York Puerto Rican Day Parade because all Puerto Rican flags were illegal on the island from 1948 until 1957.
And you know what? It's ironic that he says that because that's how I started my journey of knowledge, right? Trying to get a better understanding of where I came from, who I was after my father passed away. So that led me on a road of understanding the dynamics that they were going through, understanding the struggle, understanding the continuation of, what happened then to what's going on now. So this made me want to understand the rabbit hole a little bit more than what I did it back then, which led me into where I'm at today. And this is why I love to educate, because I believe we can all see ourselves in history. And with these components, we'll be able to plug things together that probably didn't make sense to us before, especially on the psychological tip. But let's get back into it. Let's tap that screen, guys. Let's share this live. Let's try to get some more viewers in here.
Even a Nobel Prize nominee, Francisco Matos Paoli, was sentenced to 20 years in La Princesa for owning one. Over time, I became a lawyer, the editorial director of El Diario La Prensa, and a New York State Assemblyman. This enabled me to access more people and information, but I still wasn't writing a book. And then I saw the FBI files. The Bureau kept secret dossiers on Puerto Ricans for over 60 years.
Listen, guys.
There are 1.8 million pages of files about Albizu Campos, the Nationalist Party, Puerto Rico's October 1950 revolution, and over 100,000 Puerto Ricans, most of whom had no idea that they were being followed. These files contain surveillance notes, telephone taps, bank account information, criminal and medical records, tax returns, credit card numbers, professional licenses, school transcripts, child support payments, home mortgage documents, job applications, voting and credit histories, wedding lists, sexual profiles, and neighborhood gossip. The FBI used them to monitor and control people. The Bureau also used them to destroy careers. When I saw these files, I thought of my father. Infuriated, I finally decided to write this book. I read thousands of FBI documents and hundreds of newspaper accounts. I scoured university, museum, and historical society archives. I tracked down oral histories, personal interviews, private correspondence, diaries, church registries, and old photos. I read amicus curiae briefs, congressional testimony, Senate committee reports, CIA manuals, and Defense Department contracts. I walked the streets of Puerto Rico where people had been murdered. I talked to their families. Then I started writing. On October 30th, 1950, a violent revolution swept through Puerto Rico. Nationalist assassins were sent to kill President Harry S. Truman. Gunfights roared in 8 towns. Revolutionaries burned police stations, post offices, and selective service centers, representative of the U.S. presence, to the ground. A bloody shootout raged at the Salon Boricua barber shop. A 3-hour gunfight between 40 U.S. National Guardsmen, armed with machine guns, grenades, bazookas, rifles, and carbines, the Insular Police, and one lone barber named Vidal. Puerto Rican radio stations covered the battle live and broadcast it over the entire island. To suppress the revolution, the U.S. Army deployed 5,000 troops and bombarded 2 towns. The only time in history that the United States has bombed its own citizens. They also arrested thousands of nationalists and imprisoned their leader, Albizu Campos. While Albizu was in prison, evidence strongly indicates the U.S. government subjected him to lethal radiation until it killed him. This is not a pretty story.
Nope.
If it helps you to understand the world in which we live, then I have done my job. The rest is up to you.
Really quick, guys. Thank you guys for participating and joining. That was the introduction. Really quick, if I'm a little low on YouTube, guys, and if you guys don't know on TikTok, I'm live on YouTube. So if you want to be able to go watch this later on, it should save to my video upload so you guys can rewatch it later on. If I'm a little bit low, I'm going to speak a little bit louder because, again, I don't have my mic set up on YouTube yet. New iPad, new plugins. I got to figure it out. I got to order some stuff. But I didn't want to miss the opportunity since I had you guys subscribe and I said I was going to go on YouTube live, do a live. I just had to do it. So let's continue with the next chapter. Tap the screen, share this live on both ends. If you guys can do me a favor, if you want to go watch on YouTube and be able to share that to other people. Again, this is my first time live on YouTube. I have a better following on TikTok than on YouTube, but I'm trying to get there. We don't know what's going to happen with TikTok, so this is why we're here right now. Let's tap that screen, share this live, and let's keep it going. Positive vibrations only. This is a safe space. We do not like negativity.
Facts. Chapter 1. La Princesa. In 1808, it was a beautiful Spanish castle. In 1976, a U.S. district court ordered it shut down forever, calling it a notorious monument to man's inhumanity to man. By 1950, it was already a brutal prison, where inmates were starved, tortured, and used for medical experiments. People called it La Princesa, the princess, but it was actually a graveyard, designed to break men and women, to kill their spirits, to grind them into drones, then animals, then feces and ash. The prison housed over 600 souls. At least 50 were blind, crippled, lacked an arm, had elephantiasis, or were hunchbacked. Humans with every imaginable deformity walked about in rags, and none were excused from work of some kind or another. On the outside, it looked like a quaint Spanish mission. Wood and red brick masonry and white-framed windows, nestled behind swaying palm trees, and topped by a 4-foot clock, a trim cupola, and a U.S. flag. Inside, it was a rectangular stone fortress, about 100 by 30 feet, with a cement courtyard in the center ringed by cells on 3 sides. The 4th side was an 18-foot wall with a catwalk patrolled by guards with rifles and dogs. The prison's 3 galerias, galleries, totaled 7,744 square feet and held over 400 inmates, providing less than 20 square feet per inmate. 3 galleritas, little galleries, held another 150. A quarantine gallery held the mentally deranged, and 30 calabozos, dungeons, held the difficult prisoners. After the nationalist revolt of October 1950, the jail became so crowded that Galleria prisoners had to sleep on the floors and in hallways and bathrooms. In the Galleritas, 2 or 3 men slept in every bed, some of which had no mattresses and most of which had no sheets. Many of the mattresses were old, dirty, worn, and torn. Even in the Hospitalito, the medical clinic, inmate patients had to sleep on the bare floor. The dungeons, arranged along a hallway on the 1st floor, 15 to a side, all divided by concrete partitions, were famous throughout Puerto Rico. This hallway was covered with filth, barely lit and poorly ventilated. Each row of 15 cells shared a common roof of iron bars as thick as railroad tracks, topped with steel walkways. The guards patrolled them from opposite ends, stopping when they met in the middle to retrace their steps. It was a vantage point, like a captain's bridge. The guards could look down and see every occupant of every cell. They could also point their rifles at them. Each dungeon held one inmate, one can of water, and one bucket for human excrement. That was all. There was no sink or toilet, no bed, mattress, or blanket, no other furniture. Prisoners slept on the floor, and after using the buckets, covered them with their shirts to combat the stink and the scarab beetles, which loved to eat from the buckets. The only air and light entered through the iron bar ceilings, 12 feet over the prisoners' heads. A nauseating odor permeated the entire area. It floated up from the buckets, which were emptied only once every 24 hours. Each morning, 2 forlorn prisoners and 4 armed guards went from cell to cell. The prisoners entered, lugged out the buckets, and emptied them into a barrel hanging from their shoulders on 2 wooden bars. The stench of crap and urine was suffocating. Sometimes, if they felt like it, the guards brought the inmates breakfast at the same time the buckets were emptied. Breakfast was short and simple. A cup of black coffee, agua de arroz, water in which rice had been boiled, and a lump of old bread. Lunch and dinner were rice and beans. Once a week, the inmates received carne molida, ground beef, or spam frito, fried spam. Even as they ate, the inmates fought off mosquitoes that flew down from the ceiling, rats that stole their bread, and bedbugs that migrated from cell to cell in search of warm bodies. The dungeons were filled with sick men. After a few months in confinement, with little food, light, exercise, or fresh air, they became walking skeletons. They grew anemic, suffered from dysentery, hookworm, malaria, and scurvy. As their digestive systems shut down, they lost all desire to eat. Many inmates did not survive the dungeons. The warden didn't care, because the calabozos housed highly accomplished criminals, men convicted of theft, looting, arson, murder, and even cannibalism. But the most dangerous prisoners were the nationalists, and these he did care about. The career of every prison official in La Princesa, from warden to guard, would be destroyed if the nationalists caused any trouble, inspired prisoners to revolt, or attracted attention from the press. And so they had to be isolated. The nationalists spent more time in the dungeons than any other group, including the murderers and cannibals.
And like we discussed in the last book, right, when we were just talking about like the espionage, when we were talking about the Queen of Cuba, right? And I mentioned to you guys, I was like, what the United States deems domestic T word, right, terrorism, they treat it more harsh than they do, say, international terrorists or T words, or however y'all want to say it on TikTok or YouTube. And if you look at that, proof is in the pudding when you look at places like ADX, where you have individuals that were born and raised here, have 20 something years, no interaction, no human contact, no none of that. And this is because why? They have the power to influence the people, for right or for wrong. However you decide to look at it, that's how you look at it. But the fact of the matter is that those individuals the government deems more dangerous is because they can control the people of which the government trying to govern. You get what I'm saying? So when it comes to the harsher laws, especially domestically, in the way people here in the States, U.S. citizens are treated here in the States, it applies the same way in other places. The way they considered individuals that we call revolutionaries, but they call T words, they treat them as such. But let's get back to the book.
After the October 30th revolts, mass arrests filled all the prisons with 3,000 prisoners for the next few months. This number gradually diminished as trials were held, and some prisoners, generally the better financed, were found innocent. The week before Christmas, 1950, the dungeons were still stuffed to capacity. One man was insane. He counted eternally, as he had for the past 6 months. 47, 48, 49.
This is heartbreaking.
47, 48, 49. 47, 48, 49. Another man sat hunched in a corner. Had he risen, he would have stood 6 feet tall, but he was too weak to stand. He'd been in the dungeon for over a year, weighed 110 pounds, and was starving.
Salute to Don Pedro y su Campos. Really quick, while this is playing again, for those who are walking in right now as we speak, we are going over War Against All Puerto Ricans by Nelson Dennis. But as he's telling you the story right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go on my shelf and pull out a couple of books that I would recommend for you guys to go look on Pedro y su Campos. But I'm going to let this play out.
The third man was only 20 years old. He had a slender, boyish body and big brown eyes guarded by long, dark lashes. 2 inmates had died fighting over him. A 4th man would make a cord out of his pants and hang himself on Thanksgiving Day. A 5th man lived with a Puerto Rican upland gecko. He fed it dozens of bedbugs every day and let it crawl all over him. He also talked and sang to it. This man was a murderer. U.S. Army doctors had convinced a 6th man, named Hector, to swallow some new pills for a few weeks. He started vomiting and developed bloody diarrhea, then liver cancer. Hector belonged in a hospital, but La Princesa didn't want any bad publicity, so he went into the dungeons. The army doctors never returned. Hector's neighbor was insane and smeared feces all over dungeon number 7. Deus Dedit Marrero, a social worker in dungeon number 8, was in the process of losing his mind. He had played no part in the revolution. He was at work when it broke out on October 30th, and he was not a nationalist.
Really quick, for those joining on TikTok, I am live on YouTube as well, so if you missed out either the beginning portion or you can't stick around for the whole session, you can catch it on the recap later on my YouTube channel. So just letting you guys know, salute. Just tap that screen. Let's keep this a positive and safe space, and let's keep it going.
Unfortunately, Deus Dedit was a socialist, which was close enough for the insular police. They arrested him in his office and sentenced him to 20 years. While still in prison, Deus Dedit would learn that his pregnant wife had committed suicide, and he would end his own life. In the 9th dungeon, Francisco Matos Paoli was a nationalist and a prolific poet. A few friends sent him cigarettes and cigars, which he bartered with the prison guards for pencils. Paoli wrote every day. Sometimes he snuck a poem out to his fellow nationalists. Other times he unrolled a cigar, wrote a poem, rolled it back up, and smoked the poem. He also wrote on the floor and on every wall of his cell. Every square foot had a poem on it. The warden heard about it and made Francisco paint over the walls. But 2 weeks later, he had covered them with poems again. Separated from everyone, in the 15th dungeon, was a small man with fiery brown eyes and wet towels wrapped around his head. For several days, his legs had been black and his gums were bleeding. 59 years old and exhausted beyond measure, he paced silently up and down, always the same 5 steps, back and forth. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and turn. An interminable shuffle between the wall and door of his cell. He had no work, no books, nothing to write on. And so he walked. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and turn. His dungeon was next door to La Fortaleza, the governor's mansion in Old San Juan, less than 200 feet away. The governor had been his friend, and had even voted for him for the Puerto Rican legislature in 1932. This didn't help much now. The governor had ordered his arrest. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and turn. Life had turned him into a pendulum. It had all been mathematically worked out. This shuttle back and forth in his cell comprised his entire universe. He had no other choice. His transformation into a living corpse suited his captors perfectly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and turn. 14 hours of walking. To master this art of endless movement, he'd learned to keep his head down, hands behind his back, stepping neither too fast nor too slow. Every stride the same length. He'd also learned to chew tobacco and smear the nicotine saliva on his face and neck to keep the mosquitoes away. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and turn. The heat was so stifling, he needed to take off his clothes, but he couldn't. He wrapped even more towels around his head and looked up as the guard's shadow hit the wall. He felt like an animal in a pit, watched by the hunter who had just ensnared him. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and turn. Far away, he could hear the ocean breaking on the rocks of San Juan's harbor, and the screams of demented inmates as they cried and howled in the quarantine gallery. A tropical rain splashed the iron roof nearly every day. The dungeons dripped with a stifling humidity that saturated everything, and mosquitoes invaded during every rainfall. Green mold crept along the cracks of his cell, and scarab beetles marched single file along the mold lines and into his bathroom bucket. The murderer started screaming. The lunatic in Dungeon 7 had flung his own feces over the ceiling rail. It landed in Dungeon 5 and frightened a Puerto Rico upland gecko. The murderer, of course, was threatening to kill the lunatic. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and turn. The man started walking again. It was his only world. The grass had grown thick over the grave of his youth. He was no longer a human being, no longer a man. Prison had entered him, and he had become the prison. He fought this feeling every day. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and turn. He was a lawyer, journalist, chemical engineer, and president of the Nationalist Party. He was the first Puerto Rican to graduate from Harvard College and Harvard Law School, and spoke 6 languages. He had served as a first lieutenant in World War I and led a company of 200 men. He had served as president of the Cosmopolitan Club at Harvard and helped Eamon de Valera draft the Constitution of the Free State of Ireland. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and turn. He would spend 25 years in prison, many of them in this dungeon, in the belly of La Princesa. He walked back and forth for decades, with wet towels wrapped around his head. The guards all laughed, declared him insane, and called him El Rey de las Toallas, the King of the Towels. His name was Pedro Albizu Campos.
That was a heavy one. That was a heavy one. And like I said, when I hear this story, it's so familiar because this is what a lot of our individuals, our brothers, our sisters, our community members. These are what they go through when they get incarcerated. Some more harsh than others, depending on what you've done and how you've done it. But when you look at places like Florence ADX and you see places that is specifically for segregation and to keep you isolated, you know how easy it is for the psyche to be able to break down? Do you know how simple it is to be able to lose it all mentally? So how is going to be in a position of rehabilitation when you're literally putting them in a position to mentally collapse? That's not a form of rehabilitation. Make it make sense. This is why I try to tell people we got to look at things from a psychological perspective too, because that's what drives a lot of us. That's what really, makes us go and do what we do. The psychological aspect, whether it's right or wrong. We can't sit there and critique it. We don't sit there and try to understand, especially when we understand that we had lack of services, lack of resources in our community. And mind you, this is someone who's highly educated, someone who's a part of the movement, someone who's well known. So imagine how much more isolation you would need that individual from the rest of the population. Just think about it. But let's get back to the next chapter, guys. Salute to everybody tapping in. We're live on YouTube right now. YouTube, we're live on TikTok. So if you guys want to recap and go watch later, you guys can catch the episodes on YouTube. So just in case you guys missed it. But let's get back into it.
400 years of solitude. The King of the Towels was in jail for a serious reason. He was trying to reverse 400 years of history. In the sun-splashed paradise of Puerto Rico, you can lie on a beach in the morning, hike through a rainforest during the day, and spend the evening exploring the ancient walls of a colonial city. The white coastal sands glitter like sugar. The water is so pristine that, from an airplane, you'll see several shades of turquoise between the shore and the deep blue of the ocean. Through the middle of the island, the Cordillera Mountains form a series of misty ridges, draped in thick Sierra palm and pine forest, whose foothills taper gracefully into the Caribbean. Over 1,000 silver streams and rivulets gush down the mountains and rush headlong into the sea. The world's third longest underground river, the Rio Camui, lies under a beautiful, vast cave system. 10 miles of cool limestone caverns and 220 caves, packed with dripping stalactites, giant stalagmites, and flowstone walls. El Yunque is the only subtropical rainforest in the United States. Wreathed in clouds or framed against a cobalt sky, it rises majestically, with a canopy of forest trees, plunging waterfalls, and natural swimming pools. Its 28,000 acres nourish over 50 species of orchids, as well as giant tree ferns, sierra plants, bamboo thickets, heliconia, ginger, and 225 native tree species, all thriving in an explosion of color and natural beauty. It also houses lizards, iguanas, the coqui tree frog, and 79 types of birds, including the rare green-feathered Puerto Rican parrot, rarely seen outside the Puerto Rican legislature and Washington, D.C. The entire island is volcanic and its soil is very rich. It is strategically located between North and South America, the first major landmass that a Spanish galleon would encounter after a long and harrowing voyage. For all those reasons, over 4 centuries, Puerto Rico became a military and political football. The abuse of the island started early. In 1493, Columbus made his second voyage to the New World with 17 ships, 1,200 men, horses, cattle, guns, and smallpox. When he finally reached a major island, it happened to be Puerto Rico. The Taino Indians welcomed Columbus, but they made a big mistake.
Yep.
They showed him some gold nuggets in a river and told him to take all he wanted. Naturally, this started a gold rush. Spain named the island Puerto Rico, meaning rich port, and invaded with embroidered Bibles and African slaves. They enslaved the Tainos as well. Every Taino over the age of 14 had to produce a hawk's bell of gold every 3 months, or have their hands cut off.
Listen, guys.
Since they'd never seen a hawk, a horse, an armored man, or fire-breathing muskets, the Tainos did as they were told. To make matters worse, a strange plague, smallpox, was killing all the Tainos, but sparing the Spaniards, which meant they must be gods, or at least immortal. This didn't sit well with an old Taino named Urayawan, and so in 1511, he conducted a little experiment. He told a lonely Spaniard named Diego Salcido that a lake filled with virgins was waiting for him. Diego dashed right over, but met a lake full of Taino warriors instead. After they drowned him, Urayawan watched and poked and smelled the body for 3 days. When Diego began to rot, Urayawan spread the news. Riots broke out all over the island, and Ponce de Leon shot 6,000 Tainos in order to maintain public order and respect for the Queen. 3 centuries later, there were no Tainos left, but the situation hadn't changed much. Puerto Rico was still a political football. In 1812, the first Spanish constitution, the Cadets Constitution, was extended to Puerto Rico, and the island became a province of Spain, with the same rights as other provinces. In 1814, the Cadets Constitution was repealed. In 1820, it was restored, and in 1823, it was abolished. In 1824, the Spanish governor was again given absolute power over Puerto Rico.
Listen, guys.
On September 23rd, 1868, nearly 1,000 men rose up in the town of Lares to demand independence from Spain. By midnight, they'd taken over the municipal seat of government, deposed the Spanish officials, arrested the Spanish merchants, and hauled them all off to jail. They hoisted a white flag with the inscription, Libertad o Muerte, Vive Puerto Rico Libre, Año 1868. Liberty or death, Free Puerto Rico lives, year 1868. They took the town hall and forced the parish priest to celebrate a Te Deum for the establishment of the Republic. Then they declared Puerto Rico independent, installed a provisional government, and offered freedom to any slave joining their cause. The next afternoon, the Spanish militia from nearby Pepino routed the rebels, and troops pursued them from Aguadilla to Arecibo. El Grito de Lares had ended. In response to it, however, a liberal constitution was adopted in 1869, which restored Spanish citizenship to Puerto Ricans, as well as the right to representation in the Cortes Generales, the Spanish parliament. 30 years later, in 1897, the Spanish Prime Minister signed the Carta de Autonomía, Charter of Autonomy, which granted Puerto Rico the right to its own legislature, constitution, tariffs, monetary system, treasury, judiciary, and international borders. After 400 years of colonial rule, the charter created the Free Republic of Puerto Rico. Elections for the new legislature were held in March 1898, and the new government was scheduled for installation in May. On May 12th, cannon blasts awakened everyone in San Juan, as 12 U.S. battleships, destroyers, and torpedo boats bombarded the city for 3 hours, turning the sky black with cannon smoke. Homes were hit, streets were torn. El Morro Lighthouse and La Iglesia de San Jose, a 16th century church, was shelled repeatedly. The governor ran to Fort San Felipe del Morro to defend the island with 3 Ordóñez cannons. But San Juan became a ghost town, as 30,000 residents fled the city, the world shattering all around them. The Spanish-American War, declared by the United States on April 25th, had arrived in Puerto Rico. When U.S. soldiers invaded the inner towns, the New York Times trumpeted, "Our flag raised in Puerto Rico." As the war continued and U.S. troops marched through the island, the Puerto Rican bourgeoisie was still buzzing about liberation. But the peasants, sick of politics, politicians, and promises, no matter what country they came from, couldn't care less. When the American soldiers passed by, local dogs barked at them, and farmers kept plowing their fields.
Really quick, guys, for those who are just now joining us, top of the afternoon, to everybody, today is the first day that we're live on YouTube. So if you guys missed the beginning part of this live, you can go back and catch it later on YouTube. Or if you want to go over to switch over to YouTube and go watch it over there and bring me more traction and give me more likes, I appreciate that love and support as well. But let's keep tapping that screen, sharing this live. And if you don't know the YouTube, it's exactly the same as my name here, AfroTaino 88. So you guys be able to catch me here during the day, and if you can't catch it during the day, you guys can catch me later on at night, and you can go watch it again on YouTube. But salute to everybody, guys. Let's keep tapping the screen. Let's keep making this a safe and positive space. This is an educational space. This is not for bochinche. It's not for none of that back and forth. We're trying to uplift and teach each other and show each other things that we may or may not know. So let's get it, guys. Let's keep tapping that screen and sharing this live.
The change in sovereignty, with the same fatalism with which they accepted hookworms, hurricanes, and tuberculosis. Americans were more upbeat about the matter. "Give my best love to Nanny, and do not make peace until we get Puerto Rico," wrote Theodore Roosevelt to Senator Henry Cabot Lodge in 1898. "Puerto Rico is not forgotten," replied the senator. "We mean to have it." The New York Journal of Commerce declared, "We must have Puerto Rico, because when a territory of that nature falls into our hands, it must never be parted with."
You hear that?
The New York Times noted the commercial value of Puerto Rico and the wisdom of taking and keeping it for all time. According to the Times, it was a charming winter resort, a fine naval station with a commanding position between two continents, and an island well worth having. In language akin to that of Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden, the Times concluded, "We need it as a station in the great American archipelago. We are not pledged to give Puerto Rico independence. It would be much better for her to come at once under the beneficent sway of these United States than to engage in doubtful experiments at self-government, and there is no reason to believe that her people would prefer it." Even the poet Carl Sandburg, who saw active service in Puerto Rico with the 6th Illinois Infantry during the war, wrote, "For 400 years this island has been run by a Spanish government in Madrid. Now it was to be American, and it was plain that the island common people liked the idea." On July 4th, 1898, in the Central Presbyterian Church of Brooklyn, the Reverend J.F. Carson read from the Holy Bible.
Thank you for the
"And
gifts.
Joshua took the whole land, and the land rested from war." He sermonized that the supreme business of this republic is to end the Spanish rule in America. And if to do that it is necessary to plant the stars and stripes on Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, or Spain itself, America will do it. That same night, in the Presbyterian Church of Fifth Avenue, the Reverend Robert Mackenzie prophesied, "God is calling a new power to the front. The race of which this nation is the crown is now divinely thrust out to take its place as a world power." Senator Albert J. Beveridge also saw a divine plan. "God has not been preparing the English-speaking and Teutonic peoples for 1,000 years for nothing," he declared. "He has made us adept in government so that we may administer government amongst savages and senile peoples." On July 21st, 1898, the U.S. government issued a press release stating, "Puerto Rico will be kept. Once taken, it will never be released.
Listen, guys.
It will pass forever into the hands of the United States. Its possession will go towards making up the heavy expense of the war to the United States. Our flag, once run up there, will float over the island permanently." On the floor of the U.S. Senate, Republican Senator Joseph B. Foraker declaimed, "Puerto Rico differs radically from any other people for whom we have legislated previously. They have no experience which would qualify them for the great work of government, with all the bureaus and departments needed by the people of Puerto Rico." Within a few years, Puerto Rico would be stuffed with bureaus and departments, becoming a base for Roosevelt's big stick policy in the Caribbean. In fact, nearly a decade before the Spanish-American War, U.S. President Benjamin Harrison and Secretary of State James G. Blaine had already been considering the island's value as a Navy coaling station, provision center, and stepping stone to the Latin American market. Eugenio Maria de Hostos, the great Puerto Rican educator, summed it up as follows: "How sad and overwhelming and shameful it is to see Puerto Rico go from owner to owner without ever having been her own master, and to see her pass from sovereignty to sovereignty without ever ruling herself." The United States told Puerto Ricans a very different story, however. On July 29, 1898, 4 days after the landing of American troops, Major General Nelson Appleton Miles issued a proclamation from his military headquarters in Ponce. It was the first official public statement from the U.S. government explaining its plans for Puerto Rico. The chief object of the American military forces will be to overthrow the armed authority of Spain and to give to the people of your beautiful island the largest measure of liberties consistent with military occupation. We have not come to make war against a people of a country that for centuries has been oppressed, but on the contrary, to bring you protection, not only to yourselves, but to your property, to promote your prosperity, to bestow upon you the immunities and blessings of the liberal institutions of our government, and to give the advantages and blessings of enlightened civilization.
But yet they took everything from us, put us in a state of survival mode. Or like I don't understand this. This is the false propaganda that they spew to individuals to have them believe that they're gonna be their savior, the end all be all. And again, there's no real shots at anyone. This is just speaking facts. It is the propaganda and the manipulation that has the individuals in the state the way they're at right now. And it's due to the psychological warfare based on the United States.
This enlightened civilization.
Really quick, guys, I gotta run out the room for about 2 minutes. I'll be right back. Let's keep tapping the screen. Let's keep keeping this a safe and positive space. And again, guys, we're live on YouTube, so if you guys want to go check it out on YouTube and you want to switch over to YouTube, be my guest because it's showing me a little bit more extra support on YouTube. It's just new to me on YouTube, so if you guys want to check me out, please switch over. If not, you're going to be able to catch it later if you missed out a little bit on TikTok. But let's keep it going, guys. I got to run out the room for 2 seconds. Give me a minute.
Some firm views about their neighbors. On February 22nd, 1899, the New York Times ran an article headlining, "Americanizing Puerto Rico," describing Puerto Ricans as uneducated, simple-minded, and harmless people who are only interested in wine, women, music, and dancing. As late as 1940, Scribner's commentator stated, "All Puerto Ricans are totally lacking in moral values, which is why none of them seem to mind wallowing in the most abject moral degradation." In 1948, popular writers were still ranting that Puerto Ricans are not born to be New Yorkers. They are mostly crude farmers, subject to congenital tropical diseases, physically unfit for the northern climate, unskilled, uneducated, non-English speaking, and almost impossible to assimilate and condition for healthful and useful existence in an active city of stone and steel. The most colorful and color-conscious opinions were voiced by the southern wing of the Democratic Party. Here are some choice words on the floor of the U.S. Senate from Senator William B. Bate, Democrat of Tennessee, who had served as a major general in the Confederate Army. What is to become of the Philippines and Puerto Rico? Are they to become states with representation here from those countries? From that heterogeneous mass of mongrels that make up their citizenship? That is objectionable to the people of this country, as it ought to be, and they will call a halt to it before it is done. Jefferson was the greatest expansionist, but neither his example nor his precedent affords any justification for expansion over territory in distant seas, over peoples incapable of self-government, over religions hostile to Christianity, and over savages addicted to headhunting and cannibalism, as some of these islanders are. The national perception was clear. Puerto Ricans were ignorant, uncivilized, morally bankrupt, and utterly incapable of self-rule. The U.S. would protect them, tame their savagery, manage their property, and deliver them from 400 years of solitude. Chapter 3. Our children speak English and Spanish. Central Grammar School was a former military armory, a stone building looming over calles San Francisco and Luna, in the heart of Old San Juan. In 1908, it stood next to a chicken slaughterhouse and had a concrete yard enclosed by an iron-spiked fence, with heavy double doors that slammed shut as students walked in. Stuffed birds, monkeys, and other animals in dusty glass cages lined the long, dark hallways. No one knew how they got there or where they were going. The students wore green and yellow uniforms, sat in neat little rows with their hands folded, and called their teachers Mister and Mrs. They started each day with the Pledge of Allegiance, then sang a patriotic ditty. Puerto Rico is a beautiful island. It belongs to the United States. Our children speak English and Spanish and salute our flag every day. Their flag was the Stars and Stripes, which hung in every classroom. The teachers wore starched blouses or crisp white shirts and wiped their foreheads with crumpled handkerchiefs all day. In the early 1900s, the most popular teacher was Mrs. Del Toro in room 9, because she wore sweat pads under her arms. Every morning, the strings holding them in place slipped out of the short sleeves of her starched white shirts, and she had to turn her back in order to adjust them. The children always loved that. Then she would get down to teaching. On a given day, while displaying a chart of the major food groups, she might explain in barely comprehensible English the importance of nutrition and eating all the foods on the chart. Broccoli and carrots, turnips and iceberg lettuce, plums, a large meatloaf, and other strange items. If a child remarked that none of the vegetables on the chart grew in Puerto Rico and the class laughed, Mrs. Del Toro would slam her pointer on the blackboard. By way of punishment, she might move on to mathematics, instructing the children to pull out books written entirely in English, as she wrote an equation on the board. 1/2 equals how many eighths? Now remember, to change the denominator of a fraction, you first divide the first denominator by the second denominator, she would explain. The children would look at each other and scratch their heads, not having the faintest idea what she'd said, and unable to read the English language math books. After lunch, Mrs. Del Toro might settle the class down with a little song. Pollito, chicken. Gallina, hen. Lápiz, pencil y pluma, pen. Ventana, window. Puerta, door. Maestra, teacher. Y piso, floor.
Now I told this on one of my lives down the line. So my great grandmother, she passed away a couple of years ago, but she had Alzheimer's and dementia, and just to understand the indoctrination that the system has projected onto our people, could you guys believe when my mom went to go visit her at the home, that out of all the things she forgot, the one thing that she could remember was that jingle he just sang and recited? And that goes to show you the power of indoctrination and how they ingrained it in you for you to understand it, for you to get it. That's some heavy shit, guys. I don't understand if y'all know the level of indoctrination that takes to get a person to even remember in that state of mind. But let's get back to the book.
With her ruler, she would point at the chickens in the slaughterhouse across the street, at the pencil on a student's desk, at the pen on her own desk, at the window, the door, herself, and the dull wooden floor. Very good, she would exclaim, then unfurl a map at the front of the room. Today we study the geography of the United States. For the next hour, the children might memorize the names of states, cities, lakes, and rivers 2,000 miles away that they had never seen or heard of.
Facts.
They might learn about an American progress that brought railroads, electricity, telegraph lines, Christianity, and light to that far-flung continent that drove bears, bison, and Native Americans off the map.
Listen, guys.
They might learn about Theodore Roosevelt, the President of the United States, and how he led the Rough Riders up San Juan Hill and shot the Spaniards and risked his life to liberate Puerto Rico.
Listen, guys.
If the children behaved, the day would end with another fun song, albeit one that no one understood. My boni lie sober de ochan. My boni lie sober de si. My boni lie sober de ochan. Oh, bring back my Bonnie to me.
Listen.
This unfortunate scenario was playing out all over the island.
Mm-hmm.
Within 10 years of U.S. occupation, every subject, in every class, in every public school was being taught in English. The textbooks were all written in English as well, even though none of the students and few of the teachers could understand them. Beyond the obvious plan to enrich a few well-connected U.S. publishers and pedagogues, this represented a direct assault on 400 years of language and culture, under the guise of civilizing a savage people. Educators like Paulo Freire, as well as sociologists and historians, have studied this civilizing dynamic in colonial relationships.
Really quick, guys, both platforms, let's get the likes up there. Let's tap that screen, share this live. Let's try to get as much knowledge and education to our people. Again, I do believe in socialism, free housing, free education, and free healthcare. So by tapping the screen and sharing this live, it's showing me a little bit of socialist love and support to be able to get the message out to the masses. Again, this is a story that needs to be told and needs to be heard. So let's get it, let's get active, and let's keep tapping.
In the case of a colony, which by its very nature is the object of exploitation by the political power, the purpose of every colonial administration is and has always been to overcome, by all possible means, the resistance of the subjugated power. To accomplish this goal requires the active control by those in power of the cultural and educational systems. The president of the Puerto Rico House of Representatives, Cayetano Coli Cuchi, recognized it immediately. We knew perfectly well that the soul of a people is incarnated in its language. We would have preferred being without a country to losing our native tongue.
Listen, guys.
On this issue, we joined battle, and my friends and I threw ourselves into the fight. It was more like trench warfare. In 1902, the Official Language Act, a component of the U.S. Foraker Act.
Pay attention, guys. This is crucial to understand how we got from point A to point B.
All insular governmental departments, courts, and public offices would use English as a co-equal language. Then the U.S. appointed Commissioner of Public Instruction ordered that all school children must start the school day saluting the American flag, declaiming the Pledge of Allegiance, and singing the national anthem in English. Finally, in 1909, the commissioner decreed that speaking Spanish was forbidden in all public schools, and that...
Really quick, can one of my moderators pin the YouTube channel in the comment for the people on YouTube and TikTok?
Everyone, both teachers and students, could be disciplined for violating this rule. For a while, the English attack worked. On an island where most people lived and died within a 20-mile radius, everyone struggled to learn a language spoken 1,000 miles away. Then something akin to the War of the Worlds occurred. In that novel, Earth is powerless to stop an alien invasion until the humblest creatures, bacteria, destroy the aliens and save mankind from extinction. In a similar fashion, the children of Puerto Rico got fed up with bad report cards and simply stopped going to school. Even under the threat of expulsion, they still refused to attend. Anything was better than going home with a D in every subject and catching a beating from their parents. In this manner, children aged 6, 7, and 8 succeeded where the adults failed. As of 1915, English was still the official language in Puerto Rico's high schools, but Spanish was restored in the grammar schools. Coincidentally, The War of the Worlds was published in 1898, the same year that the United States invaded Puerto Rico. Chapter 4. The Green Pope.
Listen up.
From the air, the narrow coastal plain of southern Puerto Rico looks like an irregular green ribbon. It contrasts sharply with the blue waters to the south and the craggy mountains to the north. During the early 1900s, sugarcane, many miles of it in every direction, covered the plain. A railroad cut through the cane, running parallel to the sea and linking the towns along the southern coast. Most people lived in shacks along that railroad, in barracks and houses around the plazas of the sugar haciendas, or in company towns built near the monster cane grinding mills. The mills were the most conspicuous landmarks. Their chimneys cast long shadows over the shacks and across the cane, exhaust plumes rising hundreds of feet into the air. From far away, the workers' shacks looked regular and neat. The thatched roofs, the waving palms, and the nearness of the sea seemed almost picturesque. Up close, however, the villages told a different story. Tin cans, paper, coconut husks, and cane trash littered the hard and dusty ground. The houses were patched with old Coca-Cola signs, boards torn from packing cases, and cardboard. Only a few were painted. Inside, large families crammed into tight living spaces. Curtains draped over laundry lines divided houses into 2, 3, or more sections. These villages were all bunched around the colonias, the great farms of the corporations that controlled 98% of the cultivated land in the municipality of Santa Isabel. The largest farm was Colonia, Florida, with its own company store, 36 two-room shacks, a 2-story house for the major domo, overseer, and 2 barracks left over from the days of slavery. In southernmost Santa Isabel, a cluster of houses on the sea and along the Ponce and Guayama Railroad and the Central Canovanas Railroad link resembled hundreds of other line villages on the southern coast. It had 6 small stores, no church or post office, and no electricity or running water. Its residents' entire lives revolved around and depended on one thing: the cutting of sugarcane. At 5 a.m., 6 days a week, Santa Isabel was still and barren. The roosters crowed, dogs barked, and the surf sounded softly a few hundred feet away. The shacks were shut against the night air as an easterly breeze stirred the cane and rattled the Coca-Cola signs. An hour later, the village came to life. Shutters swung open and tendrils of smoke curled from outdoor stoves on which fresh coffee boiled. Men moved from the thatched shacks along the railway toward the old haciendas to get their daily work orders. Some worked as macheteros, sugarcane cutters. Others were cultivators, seed cutters, vagoneros, ox cart loaders, or fulgoneros, rail car loaders. Every fulgonero hoisted more than 50,000 pounds of sugarcane onto a railway car every day with his bare hands. Like many barrio elders, Don Tomas was a palero, ditch digger, the highest skilled and best paid job in the fields. Another old man, Don Daniel, liked to plant seed, a curious choice for such a tall man, because seeding required him to bend over continuously, setting and trapping the seed, which was not a seed at all but a cutting of cane stalk, into place. 12-year-old Julio Feliciano Colon was a cutter, the most backbreaking work of all. Every dawn he set out to defenderse, to fend for himself and his family. Every evening he came home drenched from head to toe with sweat. 6 days a week, Julio and a line of men stood before the cane like soldiers before an enemy. They seemed tiny but implacable, cutting 15-foot stalks with their machetes, each man cutting over 1,000 pounds of cane per hour. They lopped off the leaves, cut the stalks in halves or thirds, and dropped the pieces behind them. Every 2 or 3 hours, they'd load the cane onto the ox carts. By the end of the day, the cane fragments would stick to their skin. The cane choked off any breeze, and the soil radiated heat like an oven. Julio would sweat profusely all day as he grunted and strained alongside the oxen. Crane flies and gnats flew into his mouth when he spoke, and he spat them out like coffee grounds. Mosquitoes bit his eyelids, nostrils, lips, and gums, and flew into his ears like buzzing jets.
Really quick, for those who are just joining us, we are also live on YouTube. It is the same name as my TikTok, so you guys can go check me out on YouTube. And if you missed the beginning portion, you want to be able to catch this book entirely, we are going to be uploading, well, we're going to do a live every day. So if you guys miss what's going on throughout the day, or you guys miss certain portions, It's available later on or even available now. So if you guys want to hop over to YouTube, be my guest, show some love and support.
Julio did not complain. His father had been a polero, but he'd died 4 years earlier. Now Julio woke up and faced the cane to help feed his mother and younger brother. He hadn't planned it that way. He'd been a good student, particularly in mathematics and geography. Every few weeks, the schoolmaster would raid the cane fields, grab Julio and other truant boys, and haul them back to the schoolhouse. It didn't matter. The next day, Julio would be cutting cane again. He worked for $4 a week and spent most of it at the Colonia Florida company store, where all the food was dispensed through shaded windows, so he couldn't watch it being weighed. He knew he was being cheated. Julio ate rice and beans, salted cod, and plantains. Sometimes he was able to afford carne molida, ground beef. Mostly he was glad that his mother and brother had food. That was the main thing. His mother took in laundry and sewed blouses every day in their one-room shack, but she earned only 50 cents a week for her needlework. Every man in the village of Santa Isabel worked in the cane fields. They learned to use a blunt machete as toddlers, to catch land crabs as children, and to cut cane as teens. The few who managed to escape either ended up in jail or were never heard from again, as if the earth had swallowed them up. While sweating in the fields, the men spat out mosquitoes and joked to keep their spirits up. The younger ones talked of revolution. One claimed that he would kill 10 Yankees, then buy new shoes. Another dreamed of buying better rum. One joked that he planned to save his money and start a child labor factory. A fourth bragged that he would marry Greta Garbo. When asked his plans for after the revolution, Don Tomas replied, "I am a platonico. I grow too old for the senoritas." The older men threatened to report everyone to the major domo. Don Tomas explained that their revolution could never succeed because of the Green Pope, a man who sits in an office with millions of green dollars at his command. He lifts a finger and a ship starts or stops. He says a word and a republic is bought. He sneezes and a president, general, or Supreme Court judge falls. He rubs his behind on his chair and a revolution breaks out. Puerto Ricans, Don Tomas admonished, had to fight this man. But no one knew who or where he was. And even if they did find and kill the Green Pope, 100 others would replace him. Don Tomas was not far off. Shortly after the U.S. invasion, Hurricane San Ciriaco, one of the largest in Caribbean history, destroyed thousands of Puerto Rican farms and nearly the entire 1898 coffee bean crop. Of 50 million pounds, only 5 million, 10%, were saved. American hurricane relief was strange. The United States sent no money. Instead, the following year, it outlawed all Puerto Rican currency and declared the island's peso, with a global value equal to the US dollar, to be worth only 60 American cents. Every Puerto Rican lost 40% of his or her savings overnight. Then in 1901, a colonial land tax known as the Hollander Bill forced many small farmers to mortgage their lands with U.S. banks.
And this is how you force people to rely on social welfare. You remove all means of survival, forcing the people to rely on you. That's the plan, guys. The more you're relying on them, the less likely they're able to do for themselves, and you'll be able to manipulate and control the situation as much as you want because you control the means of survival for them. That's the part we gotta understand.
But with no laws restricting usury, interest rates were so high that within a decade, the farmers defaulted on their loans and the banks foreclosed. These banks then turned a diversified island harvest: coffee, tobacco, sugar, pineapple, and other fruits, into a one-crop cash cow.
Facts.
That crop was sugar. The very first civilian governor of Puerto Rico, Charles Herbert Allen, used his brief tenure to become the king of sugar. When he returned to the United States in 1901, he quickly installed himself as treasurer and then president of the largest sugar refining company in the world, the American Sugar Refining Company, later known as Domino Sugar. In effect, Allen leveraged his governorship into a controlling interest in the entire island economy. In 1922, the U.S. Supreme Court declared Puerto Rico a territory, not a state, and as such, the U.S. Constitution did not apply there. This laid the groundwork for denying any rights to work, or a minimum wage or collective bargaining granted to U.S. citizens. In 1926, President Calvin Coolidge appointed Frederick G. Holcomb, auditor for the United Fruit Company, as auditor of the entire island of Puerto Rico.
Yo, salute to everybody just coming in. Thank you guys for all the new follows. If you could do me a favor, switch over to YouTube and go follow over there just in case you missed the live earlier or you want to be able to recap and re-listen to this later on. We are live on YouTube and you can watch it later on your spare time. So salute to you guys. Thanks for the follow. I appreciate all the love and support, guys, from everybody on YouTube and TikTok.
By 1930, Allen and U.S. banking interests had converted 45% of all arable land in Puerto Rico into sugar plantations. These bank syndicates also owned the insular postal system, the entire coastal railroad, and the international seaport of San Juan. By 1934, every sugarcane farm in Puerto Rico belonged to one of 41 syndicates, 80% of which were U.S. owned. The four largest syndicates, Central Guanica, Central Aguirre, Fajardo Sugar, and United Puerto Rico Sugar, were entirely U.S. owned and covered over half the island's arable land. By itself, United Puerto Rico Sugar owned over 16,000 acres of cane-producing land, 4 sugar refining mills, warehouses, harbor facilities, port terminals, railroad cars, and more than 100 miles of railroad. With no money, no crops, and no land, Puerto Ricans sought work in the cities. But when the island legislature enacted a minimum wage law like the one in America, the U.S. Supreme Court declared it unconstitutional, despite AFL-CIO President Samuel Gompers' testimony that the salaries paid to Puerto Ricans are now less than half what they received under the Spanish. To make matters worse, U.S. finished products, from rubber bands to radios, were priced 15 to 20% higher on the island than on the mainland. Again, Puerto Rico was powerless to enact any price-fixing legislation. U.S. economic reports labeled this draining of resources from a starving population into the richest country on earth as a favorable trade balance, and the transfer of wealth did not go unnoticed. Historian Bailey W. Diffie noted in 1931, "Land is passing into the hands of a few large corporations. The sugar industry, tobacco manufacturing, fruit growing, banks, railroads, public utilities, steamship lines, and many lesser businesses are completely dominated by outside capital. The men who own the sugar companies control both the Bureau of Insular Affairs and the legislature of Puerto Rico."
Listen.
Diffie, a professor at Yale University, also remarked that practically every mile of public carrier railroad belongs to 2 companies, the American Railroad Company and the Ponce and Guayama Railroad Company, which are largely absentee-owned. Every trolley ride taken by a Puerto Rican pays tribute to a foreign owner. About half the towns depend on absentee companies for their lights and power, and more than half the telephone calls go over wires owned by outsiders. It is the absentee capitalist who has made the profit. In 1929, the American Mercury magazine also noted, "The American economy, as introduced by the Guanica, Aguirre, Fajardo, and other great centrales, was based on the $1 million mill and the tight control of the surrounding countryside. The development of large absentee-owned sugar estates makes Puerto Rico a land of beggars and millionaires, of flattering statistics and distressed realities. More and more, it becomes a factory worked by peons, fought over by lawyers, bossed by absent industrialists, and clerked by politicians. It is now Uncle Sam's second largest sweatshop. Back in the cane fields of Santa Isabel, Don Tomas didn't know any Yale professors or subscribe to the American Mercury, but he knew everything that mattered. He felt it deep in his bones. It was a tragic wisdom, because he was powerless to do anything about it. His life and death, and everything in between, were controlled by the Green Pope.
Salute to everybody. Salute to everybody. Keep tapping the screen, sharing this live. Again, we are live on YouTube as well. So if you like the content and you want to be able to catch on later on, if you missed a little bit, or if you don't get to watch me for a couple of days, you can always go back and watch the videos. The name on the YouTube is the same name as here on TikTok, AfroTaino88. So even if you guys want to switch over to help me out with my algorithm over there, y'all really appreciate all the love and support. Salute to everybody. All together, I got about 30 people watching me. So salute, peace, blessings, and positivity. Let's get back to the knowledge and education.
Chapter 5. A good career move. Barceloneta is unique among the many Puerto Rican municipalities. It is the home of a Pfizer factory that produces all of the Viagra sold in North America. Known as Ciudad Viagra, Viagra City, the town reflects a larger relationship between the island and Big Pharma. As of 2008, Puerto Rico was the world's largest shipper of pharmaceuticals, accounting for nearly 25% of total shipments. 16 of the 20 biggest-selling drugs in the United States are produced in Puerto Rico, and the profits are enormous. North American sales of Viagra exceed $1 billion per year, with profit margins of roughly 90% per pill. 70 years ago, the town had a different industry. Every year, more than 1,000 women walked into the Hospital Municipal de Barceloneta, carrying a little suitcase containing a bathrobe, underclothes, slippers, a rosary, and sometimes a Bible. Each woman would talk to a doctor, fill out a few forms, and be assigned to a bed. 2 days later, she'd walk out with her tiny newborn, the joy of her life. She didn't know, however, that her tubes had been cut and that she would never have another baby. For decades, the doctors in Barceloneta sterilized Puerto Rican women without their knowledge or consent. Even...
Y'all heard that, right? Without their knowledge or consent. Y'all hear that, right? Under the United States rule, are we correlating? We see the intersectionalities. We see how, what they do in one place, they also bring it with them and do it in other places as well. You see the intersectionalities, guys. Unity is key. When we stop separating ourselves and understand that we under the same fucking rule of thumb, we gonna have a better understanding of how we can get out of that.
About La Operación, the operation, the women were not informed that it was irreversible and permanent.
Listen.
Over 20,000 women were sterilized in this one town. This scenario was repeated throughout Puerto Rico until, at its high point, 1/3 of the women on the island had been sterilized.
1/3.
And Puerto Rico had the highest incidence of female sterilization in the world. This campaign of sterilization...
The highest percentage of female sterilization in the world at that time. At that time.
Stemmed from a growing concern in the United States about inferior races and the declining purity of Anglo-Saxon bloodlines. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Claude Fuess, a history teacher and headmaster of the prestigious Phillips Andover Academy, argued, "Our declining birth rate may perhaps indicate a step towards national deterioration. Among the so-called upper and leisure classes, noticeably among the university group, the present birth rate is strikingly low. On the other hand, among the Slavonic and Latin immigrants, it is relatively high. We seem thus to be letting the best blood thin out and disappear." At its annual convention in 1934, the Eugenics Society of Canada, ESC, advertised the keynote speech by its president, Dr. William Lorne Hutton, as follows. A brief for sterilization of the feeble-minded. Dr. Hutton and the ESC advocated the elimination of mental deficients and of races other than intelligent Anglo-Saxons. In 1927, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the state of Virginia could sterilize those it thought unfit, particularly when the mother was feeble-minded and promiscuous. 10 years later, U.S. Public Law 136 legalized all sterilization in Puerto Rico, even for non-medical reasons. In 1928, President Calvin Coolidge himself wrote, "We found the people of Puerto Rico poor and distressed, without hope for the future, ignorant, poverty-stricken and diseased, not knowing what constitutes a free and democratic government." Within this context, Dr. Cornelius Rhodes arrived in Puerto Rico and made a brilliant career move. Born on June 20th, 1898, the same year as the U.S. invasion, and the son of an ophthalmologist, Rhodes attended Bowdoin College and Harvard Medical School, where he was class president and graduated cum laude in 1924. A somewhat ungainly man with a thick beard, short neck, and a Charlie Chaplin mustache, he had a brusque manner and spoke few words. After teaching pathology at Harvard, he eventually joined the newly formed Rockefeller Anemia Commission to set up a research laboratory in San Juan Presbyterian Hospital.
Yeah, I keep telling you guys, we gotta stop trying to just hold the government responsible or accountable for reparations. We gotta be able to hold these corporations just as equally accountable, especially individuals like the Rockefeller family, who definitely has participated in a lot of fuckery within history, that's still around and that's still in high position. Come on.
Shortly after his arrival in San Juan, on the night of November 10th, 1931, Rhodes got drunk at a party. He emerged to find his car stripped and the tires flat. When he returned to his lab that night, in a foul mood and still drunk, he scrawled a note to a friend named Fred Stewart, who was a medical researcher in Boston. "I can get a damn fine job here, and I am tempted to take it. It would be ideal, except for the Puerto Ricans. They are beyond doubt the dirtiest, laziest, most degenerate and thievish race of men ever to inhabit this sphere. It makes you sick to inhabit the same island with them. They are even lower than the Italians. What the island needs is not public health work, but a tidal wave, or something to totally exterminate the entire population. It might then be livable. I have done my best to further the process of their extermination by killing off 8 and transplanting cancer into several more. All physicians take delight in the abuse and torture of the unfortunate subjects." The letter was discovered and created an uproar throughout the hospital. An investigation by San Juan District Attorney Jose Ramon Quinones confirmed that of the 13 recently deceased cancer patients at San Juan Presbyterian, 8 had indeed been in Rhodes's care. La Democracia and El Mundo published a photograph of Rhodes's letter. Copies were sent to the governor of Puerto Rico, the League of Nations, the Pan American Union, the American Civil Liberties Union, newspapers, foreign embassies, and the Vatican. They were offered as evidence of systemic and lethal U.S. racism toward Puerto Ricans. Rhodes called his letter a fantastic and playful composition, written entirely for my own diversion. His peers laughed along with him. Rhodes was never indicted and suffered no professional consequences for his actions. Throughout his long career,
He was given the fucking Nobel Peace Prize. Alright? That's the type of fucking world we live in.
he supervised a staff of several hundred chemists, technicians, statisticians, librarians, and laboratory assistants. During World War II, he was commissioned as a colonel and assigned as chief of medicine in the Chemical Weapons Division of the U.S. Army. He established U.S. Army chemical weapons laboratories in Utah, Maryland, and Panama, for which he received the Legion of Merit Award in 1945. After the war, Rhodes served as an advisor to the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, specializing in nuclear medicine. He directed the Sloan Kettering Institute, where he supervised all research related to Department of Defense radiation experiments. In the early 1950s, his Sloan Kettering team began a multi-year study of post-irradiation syndrome in humans. Many Puerto Ricans, to their astonishment, realized that exterminating 8 Puerto Ricans and transplanting cancer into several more had been an excellent career move for Rhodes in the long run. It positioned him as a talented biological warrior and created a niche for him in U.S. medical and military circles. In 1949, Rhodes was featured on the cover of the June 27th issue of Time magazine. Chapter 6. Cadets of the Republic.
Oh man, before we get into that chapter, salute to everybody tapping in on YouTube and TikTok. TikTokers, we are live on YouTube as well. So if you want to be able to catch it later, or if you want to switch over and go watch it on YouTube, be my guest, show some love and support. Again, we are going back to Yabucoa, Puerto Rico for the Young Lords Back to Borinquen project. We will be in Yabucoa from October 6th to the 15th at the Marco Sanchez Community Center. The Marco Sanchez Community Center was a school that got closed down due to lack of funds and resources, so the community has taken the school back and created it into a safe haven for the community, not just for emergency purposes, but also for community gathering. And the YouTube is the same name as here on TikTok, AfroTaino 88. So salute to everybody watching on TikTok and salute to everybody watching on YouTube. Let's get back into the book, guys. Let's keep tapping that screen, sharing this live.
Julio Feliciano Colon was not cutting sugarcane today. He was putting on a pair of white pants, black shirt, black tie, and white overseas cap with a cross of Calatrava patch. He was going to march and drill today as a member of the Cadets of the Republic.
Listen up.
No one forced Julio to become a cadet. He joined because he was tired of cutting cane 60 hours a week for a salary of $4, and because 4 Yankee companies owned most of the farmland in Puerto Rico. He joined because he was trapped like a caged animal. He joined because a man who gets up at 4 a.m. every morning, climbs a mountain in rain or fog or killing heat, and sweats all day with mosquitoes in his mouth, does not need an empire telling him how to live, which flag to wave, what language to speak, and what heroes to worship. The Cadets of the Republic marched behind 2 flags, those of Puerto Rico and the Nationalist Party. The Nationalist flag contained a white cross of Calatrava, used first during the Crusades and later by French revolutionaries. The black shirts were also symbolic, representing a luto, mourning, for the colonial condition of Puerto Rico. Founded in 1922, the Nationalist Party of Puerto Rico quickly developed a clear and elegantly simple political platform: the complete and unconditional independence of Puerto Rico from the United States. The party rarely participated in the island's elections, and after 1932 it stopped altogether. Instead, the members devoted themselves to public education, international advocacy, and the development of the Ejército Libertador de Puerto Rico, Liberation Army of Puerto Rico, also known as the Cadets of the Republic. The Cadet Corps was the official youth branch of the Nationalist Party, created in a public assembly on December 17, 1932, in the Victoria Theater in the town of Humacao. The cadets underwent a full training program that included marching, field tactics, self-defense, and survival. Since they had no firearms, they trained and marched with wooden rifles. The cadets set up recruiting stations in San Juan, Ponce, Arecibo, and a dozen other towns across the island. By 1936, over 10,000 cadets were marching and training in 21 towns. They were divided into 50 companies of 200 cadets, each with a command structure of sergeants, captains, colonels, and 1 commander-in-chief, Raimundo Diaz Pacheco. All of them reported to Pedro Albizu Campos, the president of the Nationalist Party. The Cadets of the Republic and their mission were modeled on the 6-day Easter Rising of 1916 in Ireland. Their objective was not outright military victory, impossible against the United States.
Listen up.
Rather, They aimed to focus international attention on the colonial status of Puerto Rico. Cadets marched in parades, attended nationalist, patriotic, and religious events, and drilled twice a week on private farms and in vacant lots. In Rio Piedras, they drilled on the property of the White Star Bus Company and behind an electric utility plant. In Caguas, they trained in the backyard of former Insular Police Corporal Rafael Colon. They even had an air force. One airplane, owned by Horacio Narciso Basso, cadet colonels who hid the plane in plain sight, a Pan-American airplane hangar in San Juan. When 4 nationalists were killed in Rio Piedras on the orders of Police Chief E. Francis Riggs, the Bassos flew their plane over the funeral procession, dropping white lilies and a Puerto Rican flag. The cadets of the Republic also had a female component, the Nurse Corps of the Liberating Army, also known as the Hijas de la Libertad, Daughters of Freedom. They dressed in white nurses' uniforms emblazoned with the cross of Calatrava on the left shoulder. They did not drill or engage in military exercises, but instead received instruction from registered nurses and participated in parades and other public events. Nearly every cadet and nurse, except for the officers, was between 14 and 25 years old. With their wooden guns, weekend drills, and one airplane hidden in a Pan Am hangar, the cadets posed no danger to the U.S. regime. But they did represent a symbolic threat. And so, until the mid-20th century, many were shot and killed in police stations and at Palm Sunday parades, in town squares and dark alleys, in broad daylight and at dawn. The FBI followed them for 20 years and created hundreds of carpetas, surveillance files, sent directly to J. Edgar Hoover. The FBI also infiltrated the organization fiercely and with surgical precision, producing in July 1952 a 30-page dossier covering its entire 20-year history.
We gotta understand that J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI had a lot of practice before even implementing the COINTELPRO tactics that they've learned and they've mastered during the Civil Rights Movement. We gotta understand the stages. And again, when Nelson Dennis, he said a quote that, always resided with me, or resonated with me, right? It's, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happened in Puerto Rico never happened at all. And that's a fact. Because what they say is we belong to, but not a part of. That's exactly how they treat it. It's a testing site for a lot of the conditions that they also implement here.
Its origin, purpose, funding, command structure, membership, meeting venues, and activities. The dossier provided names, including those of 6 top leaders and 26 cadets, spread across 8 municipalities. The in-depth report begins with a striking admission. In bold capital letters, it states that it contains information provided by 2 individuals. The first was Faustino Diaz Pacheco. The second was Aguedo Ramos Medina. Faustino Diaz Pacheco was a 15-year member of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, whose brother, Raimundo Diaz Pacheco, was commander-in-chief of the Nationalist Liberation Army in 1950. Aguedo Ramos Medina had been the first commandant of instruction for the entire Cadets organization in 1933. In other words, the report demonstrates that for 20 years, from its very inception, the Cadets of the Republic, and therefore the entire Nationalist Party, had been infiltrated at the highest levels. The FBI knew almost every decision, every plan, every move that the nationalist leadership tried to make.
Listen up.
In Santa Isabel, a young sugarcane cutter, barely in his teens, stepped into a cadet uniform and stood proudly in his one-room shack. Julio Feliciano Colon knew his position in life. He was a jibaro, an honest and hard-working countryman. He was the property of the Green Pope, a man he had never met who controlled every aspect of his life. But for one day a week, Julio was free. A cadet, a liberator, a man with a higher purpose. He was marching toward a glorious future, or at least one without mosquitoes and a sea of sugarcane. After a few years in the Cadet Corps, he was filled with hope on March 21st, 1937, the day of the Great Cadet Parade in Ponce, Puerto Rico. It was Palm Sunday, and families from all over the island were invited. It turned into a massacre.
It's about to get heavy, guys. It's about to get heavy. We're about to go into the next chapter. Which chapter is this one? I think it's chapter. It says 7 on there, but it's a chapter behind. It's actually chapter. It says 8 there, but it's chapter 7. We're gonna start going over the Ponce Massacre. So for those who know a little bit about the Ponce Massacre, those who don't know about the Ponce Massacre, we're about to get right into it. And again, this is book is called War Against All Puerto Ricans, by Nelson Dennis. I advise everybody, it don't even just got to be Boricua. I advise everybody to go read this so you can really understand the treatment and the psychological warfare that the United States does, not only to U.S. citizens here in stateside, but also what it does when it gets other colonies and other territories and other places, and how they implements the same treatment that they implement here, if not sometimes even more crucial over there, because they don't have to be held as accountable in those places and regions on an international scale. Because again, I know it sucks and I don't want to consider, my island as property, but that's how they look at it, as property. So if it's your property, you don't got to be accountable to it. But let's get back into it, guys. Tap the screen, share this live. Again, we're also live on YouTube. So if anybody wants to switch over, tap the screen on YouTube. Help me out with the algorithm over there. I really appreciate all the love and support. But I see everybody on both platforms showing mad love and support. So peace and blessings to everybody. Let's get into the Ponce Massacre.
Chapter 7. The Ponce Massacre. For 2 years after the inception of the organization, while Julio and the cadets of the Republic ran up and down hills, marched with wooden rifles, and shouted, "Que viva Puerto Rico libre," no one in the U.S. government could have cared less. Then, in January 1934...
You know what sucks? Is that nobody in the U.S. government gives a damn now. That's the shit. They didn't give a fuck then, and they damn sure don't care now.
The Nationalist Party led an agricultural strike that paralyzed the island's sugar economy for a full month and doubled workers' wages to an average of 12 cents per hour.
Yo, we gotta understand, we went from like almost 97% agriculture to like what, something like 0.5 or something, maybe even a little bit more, a little bit less than that. Do you understand how drastically that impacts someone's economy? Especially when you're trying to convert it into what they consider like an industrial economy, where they rely more on corporations to do the hiring, such as like Walmart. Yeah, I think there's more Walmarts in Puerto Rico than any other state. Like, that's crazy. You've removed the means to survive and the means to produce for yourself, right? That survival tactic that you can produce and able to bring in to be able to survive is no longer there. Because what you force and rely is individuals to come into the island to be able to provide jobs, to be able to stabilize the economy, when a realization that's been happening for how long and it hasn't worked now at one time. Come on, we got to get it together and really put the pressure in the right places. We sit here, we preach, we go back and forth, but the reality is we're not applying pressure in the right places. We getting frustrated with all these different tax exemption policies and all these things that are coming fast. But when are we going to hold it accountable all across the board? And this is where the diaspora and the islanders really need to come together and stand on principle. Because if only one side is preaching about it and only one side is talking about it on social media, and we're not coming together as a collective to really stop these atrocities and actually force the government to be able to put proper resources and proper funding in the proper places. And we can't sit there and keep talking about the Puerto Rican government is so corrupt. Who controls the government? Last time I checked, since the Promesa happened, the Puerto Rican government cannot spend damn near no money without the consent and permission of the fiscal board the United States has implemented in Puerto Rico. So the root of the issue is not just the Puerto Rican government. It's who controls that entity. Who controls them? Who allows them to do this, that, and the third? That's what we have to put pressure on. From
that moment forward, the party was under a severe microscope. the FBI initiated round-the-clock surveillance of the nationalist leadership. An additional 115 insular police were armed with carbines, submachine guns, and grenades. Nationalists were imprisoned for incitement to riot against the United States. On October 24th, 1935, police shot and killed 4 nationalists, including the party's treasurer, Ramon Pagan, in what became known as the Rio Piedras Massacre. The incident occurred 1 block away from police headquarters, in broad daylight, before several witnesses. A stray bullet also killed an old man named Juan Munoz Jimenez, who was out buying a lottery ticket.
For everybody on TikTok, F1 in the comments, F1 in the comments. You know how TikTok is, especially when you bring in good educational, detailed books like this to be able to expose the atrocities that the U.S. government has committed or any other foreign government has committed. We understand the suppression on social media. This is also why I'm live on YouTube. So if you guys can, go subscribe, same name, same everything. Let's tap the screen. Let's get back into this.
On February 23rd, 1936, the police executed 2 more nationalists, Hiram Rosado and Elias Beauchamp, in the San Juan General Police Headquarters. Then, on March 21st, 1937, Palm Sunday, the entire island witnessed the bloodiest event in its history.
Let's see some praying hands in the comments below on both platforms. Let's get some praying hands in the comments below.
13 minutes of terror. It happened in the town of Ponce, on a pleasant corner of Calles Marina and Aurora, lined with trim 2-story buildings and flowery poinciana trees. The Ponce town square, city hall, and several churches were just 3 blocks away. The nationalists had obtained parade permits, and many of them hurried with their families from all parts of the island to assemble outside the party's clubhouse in time. By 3 p.m., the street was full with nearly 300 men, women, and children in their Sunday best. The men in straw hats and white linen suits, the ladies in flowery print dresses, and children playing all around. It looked like a festive afternoon in the park. The crowd cheered when 80 cadets of the Republic, 12 uniformed nurses, and a 5-piece marching band arrived in support of the Republic of Puerto Rico. As they approached, bystanders commented on the bright white dresses of the Hijas de Libertad, and the cadets' neat white trousers, black shirts, and small caps. Everyone smiled and waved palm fronds, in recognition of the Palm Sunday holy day. Julio Feliciano Colon marched proudly and saluted his cadet leader, Tomas Lopez de Victoria. Suddenly, the mayor of Ponce, Jose Tormos Diego, and Insular Police Captain Guillermo Soldevilla jumped into the street and told everyone to go home. The parade was over. The permit had been revoked on the governor's orders. The governor had also instructed Police Chief Enrique de Orbeta to increase the police presence and prevent the demonstration by any means necessary. Two other police captains and over...
I'm not gonna lie, they just did that at the DNC. I got some people down there marching, and that's exactly what they said. They was in Chicago and they were gonna go camp out with a permit and all that, and the Chicago PD pulled up saying that their permit has been revoked. They gotta leave, or they're gonna be physically removed. And a lot of them left, but some of them stood. And guess what? Police never showed up. Never showed up. The tactic that they used, right? Whether it was true or not, just to show you how individuals do that stuff.
Police officers stood behind Captain Soldevilla. They all wore jumpers, riding boots, and Sam Brown belts, as if dressed for a cavalry battle. They also carried Thompson submachine guns, rifles, pistols, and tear gas. The mayor, the captain, and a few nationalists argued for a minute, until Lopez de Victoria ordered the band to play La Borinqueña, the Puerto Rican national anthem, and everyone started to march, permit or no permit. The entire gathering sang along and proceeded joyfully down the street, smiling at friends and family, waving their palm fronds. Then a shot rang out. Ivan Rodriguez Figueres crumpled like a rag doll, blood spurting from his throat with each dying heartbeat. It sprayed a little girl next to him who started screaming. A second shot cracked, and Juan Torres Gregory, an 18-year-old looking out a window, fell down dead. A third shot dropped Obdulio Rosario, who was carrying a palm leaf crucifix. Obdulio's eyes widened, his mouth flew open, and blood rolled down his chin onto his shirt. His gaze ranged wildly over the crowd for a moment. Then he fell on his face and clawed outward with his fingers. Everyone stared unbelievingly at the squirming figure on the ground, as Obdulio lifted himself up with his arms, like a lizard, and then dropped for the last time. A thick stream of blood ran down the crushed rock of the roadbed. Panicked screams and curses erupted as people ran in all directions, but they couldn't escape, because Captains Guillermo Sodevilla, Perez Segarra, and Antonio Bernardi, along with 200 men with rifles and Tommy guns, were stationed all around them. They blocked every route and created a killing zone. Then they started firing. A boy was shot on a bicycle. A father tried to shield his dying son and was shot in the back. An orange vendor hid behind a statue of Jesus until a cop ran over and shot him in the head. Clouds of smoke covered the street as 20 submachine gunners set their feet and sprayed their 10-pound Tommy guns. An old man flew upward, still clutching a palm leaf in his hand. His body split almost in two. Another man raised a Bible and started to pray until the shooters blasted off the back of his head in a bright red spray. The Bible went flying and the dead man dropped like a sack of cornmeal. The flag bearer of the Cadets was killed. Carmen Fernandez grabbed the flag and was shot in the chest. Dominga Cruz Bacerril, who was visiting from another town, grabbed it and managed to run away. In a contagion of panic and savagery, the police kept firing. They shot into several corpses again and again. They fired over the corpses as if they didn't exist. Bullets flew everywhere. They hit the pavement, the buildings, the trees, and the telephone poles, filling the air with dust and grit. One could hear the dense, vibratory whap as the bullets tore into human flesh. The police climbed onto cars and running boards and chased people down the side streets, shooting and clubbing anyone they could find. They shot a young girl in the back as she ran to a nearby church. They shot a man on his way home as he yelled, "But I am a National Guardsman." They split a fruit vendor's head in two with a riot club. They beat a man to death on his own doorstep. They clubbed 53-year-old Maria Hernandez de Rosario on the head so hard that her gray matter spilled out onto the street and people kept slipping on it. They shot men, women, and children in the back as they tried to escape. They kicked several corpses to see if they were really dead and shot them again if they weren't. A policeman named Ortiz Fuentes shot 4 men who pleaded for mercy with their hands raised. The Tommy gunners kept firing, spurting .45s at full cyclic rate from a range of 50 feet. The guns overheated and started to smoke as people fell by the dozen, and blood filled the street and spattered the walls. Cadet Bolivar Marquez Terechea dragged himself to a wall. Just before dying, with his own blood, he managed to write, "Long live the Republic, down with the murderers," and signed it with 3 crucifixes. A few moments later, he stopped moving forever. The police kept shooting and clubbing for 13 minutes. By the time they finished, 19 men, 1 woman, and a 7-year-old girl lay dead. Over 200 more were gravely wounded, moaning, crawling, bleeding, and begging for mercy in the street. The air seethed with gun smoke. Everyone moved in a fog of disbelief as policemen swaggered about and blood ran in the gutter. Julio, the young sugarcane cutter, made it home that night of March 21st. He had crawled over dead bodies, dragged wounded women and children away from the machine guns, and walked carefully along the back roads between Ponce and Santa Isabel. When he arrived home around midnight, his mother screamed at the sight of his uniform, which was saturated with blood. But Julio had been lucky. He'd only been grazed by 1 bullet and sustained a flesh wound on his right arm. Many others were not as fortunate. As the smoke cleared over Calles Aurora and Marina, the following all lay dead: Ivan G. Rodriguez Figueres, Juan Torres Gregory, Conrado Rivera Lopez, Georgina Maldonado, 7-year-old girl, Genaro Rodriguez Mendez, Luis Jimenez Morales, Juan Delgado Cotal Nieves, Juan Santos Ortiz, Ulpiano Perea, Seferino Loyola Perez.
This was March 21st, 1937. March 21st, 1937.
Insular Police. Eusebio Sanchez Perez, Insular Police. Juan Antonio Pietrantoni, Juan Reyes Rivera. Pedro Juan Rodriguez Rivera. Obdulio Rosario. Maria Hernandez de Rosario. Bolivar Marquez de la Chea. Ramon Ortiz Toro. Teodoro Velez Torres.
Let's get some candles and some praying hands emojis in the comments, guys.
The cover-up. After it was all over, Puerto Rico's chief of police, Colonel Enrique de Orbeta, arrived on the scene. He walked calmly through the carnage in a bright white suit, issuing commands. When there was no one left to shoot, Orbeta looked at the corpses in a sea of blood and did some quick thinking. Although he took his orders from Governor Blanton Winship, he and his men had just killed 17 unarmed civilians and wounded 200 more. In order to explain all this, the colonel made a cruel decision. He saw a cameraman from El Mundo, Angel Lebron, running through the street, photographing everything. He also noticed a police officer, Eusebio Sanchez Perez, a victim of friendly machine gun fire. Orbeta called over the El Mundo photographer and several of his men, and they choreographed a series of live-action photos to show that the police were somehow returning fire from nationalists, who were at this point already lying dead in the street. The photos were cynical and obviously staged. One of them appeared on the front page of El Mundo on March 23, 1937, showing Colonel Orbeta and two of his men scanning the rooftops for nationalist snipers. Everyone was neatly arranged around the corpse of Officer Eusebio Sanchez Perez, who had already been killed in the policeman's own crossfire, to suggest that nationalist snipers had been shooting down at the police, and that Orbeta's officers had only engaged in self-defense. The ruse did not work. Every island newspaper reported that there was no one to exchange fire with, that the cadets, the nationalists, and everyone in the parade had been unarmed.
Listen.
That their only weapons had been Palm Sunday leaves. In the pages of El Mundo, a doctor from a local hospital, Jose A. Gandara, testified that many of the wounded he'd seen had been shot in the back. 6 days after the massacre, Florete magazine ran an illustration by popular cartoonist Manuel de Catalan. It was an exact recreation of the staged photo, with Colonel Orbeta and his two hapless policemen staring up at the rooftops, looking for non-existent snipers. The caption under the cartoon read, "Now we can say that they fired at us from the rooftops." On April 2nd, 1937, the photographer who took the panoramic shot of the massacre, Carlos Torres Morales, published his own account of what he'd seen that day. He described the massacre as a mass assassination. In addition to the still photographers taking photographs, a newsreel director named Juan Emilio Vigüe had filmed the entire slaughter from a dark window. Over the next 25 years, Vigüe would show his 13-minute movie clip to private, very carefully selected audiences. It became, in effect, the Zapruder film of Puerto Rican history. Immediately after the massacre, Governor Blanton Winship blamed it on nationalist terrorists, and his insular police followed the wounded to Tricoche Hospital in Ponce, arresting them in their stretchers and hospital beds. The Ponce District Attorney, R.V. Perez Marchand, resigned his post rather than carry out Governor Winship's order to indict the innocent survivors of the massacre for murdering themselves. But his successor, Pedro Rodriguez Serra, pressured witnesses and family members to sign false affidavits regarding the events of that day. The island newspapers, especially El Imparcial and El Mundo, whose photographers had witnessed and filmed the entire massacre, were not so easily pressured.
Listen to the comment. If the story sounds familiar, it's because they use similar tactics. They don't. Why reinvent the wheel if it works the first time, the second time, the third time, the fourth time? You may have to adjust the direction sometimes, but why reinvent it? From their perception.
And photographs of the scene.
My bad that I paused again. But that's why I say we have to look at the intersectionalities, especially when it comes to U.S. colonization and after 1898. We have to, because it's not just Puerto Rico. There's other U.S. territories that went through the same exact, if not similar stuff that Puerto Rico and even U.S. stateside went through. We got to be able to understand the intersectionalities. For real, for real.
The bullet holes from the machine guns. Their front pages screamed about the Ponce Massacre and repeated the words of slain cadet Marqués Telachea, written in his own blood. Viva la República. Abajo los asesinos. In El Norte, however, the U.S. newspapers were telling a different story. The New York Times wrote that 7 Puerto Ricans were killed in a nationalist riot, and that 68 nationalists had been arrested. The Washington Post reported that the battle started when nationalists fired on police. The Detroit News headline read, Puerto Ricans riot. Of the 14 articles that discussed the massacre in the New York Times in 1937, 11 used the word riot to describe the incident. Of the 9 articles published in the Washington Post that year, 7 used the same term. Other frequent terms in the Times and Post were outbreak, battle, disturbance, political riot, March uprising, pandemonium, liberty riots, and lamentable affair. None of the major newspapers, not one, called it a massacre, killing, slaughter, or any of the other words used by the insular press. The largest and most authoritative U.S. press organizations merely regurgitated an established narrative that Puerto Ricans had rioted on Palm Sunday and somehow shot, killed, maimed, and wounded themselves. The Hayes Commission. In the weeks following the massacre, it appeared that dozens of nationalists would be prosecuted, though no one could explain why. Perhaps for the crime of getting shot. Governor Blanton Winship told the public that his policemen had acted with great restraint and in self-defense.
That's a familiar story.
The police chief had shown great patience, consideration, and understanding, as did the officers and men under him. Accordingly, no police officer was fired, demoted, suspended, convicted, jailed, or otherwise punished. The insular press refused to let the governor get away with this charade. They hammered at him and called for his impeachment. Article upon article appeared about the massacre and its aftermath. A political cartoon in El Imparcial showed La Mano del Pueblo, the hand of the people, pointing squarely at the governor. 2 months passed. Winship stuck to his story and issued no apology. Finally, the American Civil Liberties Union, led by Arthur Garfield Hayes, conducted a 10-day investigation in Ponce and San Juan. Finally, on May 22, 1937, a throng of more than 4,000 overran the Plaza Baldoriotti in the capital, awaiting the declaration of the Hayes Commission's conclusions. Just before sunset, as the electric lights turned on in the plaza, the commission announced 3 findings. 1. The facts showed that the affair of March 21st in Ponce was a massacre. Caps, theirs. 2. Civil liberties had been repeatedly denied during the previous 9 months by order of Governor Blanton Winship, who had failed to recognize the rights of free speech and assembly, and threatened to use the force against those who would exercise those rights. 3. The Ponce Massacre arose out of the denial by the police of the civil right of citizens to parade and assemble, a denial ordered by the governor of Puerto Rico. In its formal summary, the Hayes Commission wrote, "When we began our investigation, we objected to naming our committee the Committee for the Investigation of the Ponce Massacre. Now that we have heard all the proofs, we agree that the people of Ponce had given this tragedy the only title it can possibly have, the Ponce Massacre." The island newspapers reported the findings immediately. Blanton Winship ultimately lost his governorship in 1939. The nationalists were all acquitted, and the matter was soon forgotten up north. But the full meaning of the Ponce Massacre was never lost on the people of Puerto Rico, over 20,000 of whom attended the funeral ceremonies in Ponce and Mayaguez. 17 men, women, and children had perished on Palm Sunday. 19 if you include the policemen caught in their own crossfire. Dozens more had been maimed for life. Hundreds had been wounded. A tragic awareness would soon spread throughout the island. The United States cared more about Nazi war crimes in Europe than murder in broad daylight in Puerto Rico. The police riot in Ponce, under the orders of Governor Blanton Winship, was an instance of state-sponsored terror, intended to cow an entire population into submission, particularly those who wanted independence, with a show of deadly brutality. Chapter 8.
Heavy.
It's only Chinatown.
It's only Chinatown.
When you consider, Mr. Speaker, that these gentlemen are sent there to make laws for a country they do not know, for a people whose laws cut...
Really quick, before I should have paused it before the switch over to the chapter. But guys, really quick, for those who are just now following me, today is my first day live on YouTube. We are going to do a live as we speak. So if you guys could switch over and show me some support, hit me a follow, engage a little bit over there to be able to boost up the algorithm. I really appreciate all the love and support. Again, I try to do this book club every day. So now you guys are going to have the opportunity to go back and listen to some of the books that we've done on this platform. YouTube archives all the lives, so that way, say later on today, if you caught it in the middle and you're interested in some of the information, you can go back and watch the whole live. But this is going to be the last chapter because we already maybe like an hour and a half in or something like that. I don't want to run it too crazy. I think we're about 2 hours in, but something like that. But I don't want to run it too crazy because we are dual live, and I know sometimes on the archive on YouTube it's hard for people to listen to videos more than 2 hours long. But we're going to let the next hour go by. It's 45 minutes. Let's tap the screen, share this live, and let's keep supporting one another. This is how we build community.
A language they do not know. You may imagine, Mr. Speaker, the probability of their doing well. Federico de Gateau, the first resident commissioner from Puerto Rico, speaking to the U.S. Congress in 1899. The film noir classic Chinatown is filled with rape, incest, murder, police assassins, and a massive land grab. It all ends with one of the great lines in American film. Forget it, Jake. It's Chinatown. 5 words that capture the seamy underside of the American dream. The line also encapsulates America's view of Puerto Rico throughout the early 20th century. The island was down there somewhere. Over 1,500 miles of ocean separated it from Washington, D.C. Over 1,000 miles lay between it and Miami. There were no televisions or computers. Commercial flights were few, and boat travel from New York to San Juan took 5 days. Even the U.S. Congress took 34 years to spell the island's name correctly, as Puerto Rico rather than Puerto Rico. Separated by an ocean, a language, and 400 years of Spanish history, Puerto Rico and the United States existed on the same planet, but in 2 different worlds. The concept of what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas was taken much further on the island. As far as the United States was concerned, what happened in Puerto Rico never happened at all. This attitude was clear when the American press labeled the Ponce Massacre a riot. It was clear when ownership of most of Puerto Rico's land was transferred to a few U.S. banks. It was clear when a wave of carpetbaggers descended on the island like a plague of locusts. For 50 years, Puerto Rico became the land of second chances, the place where poor relations, family embarrassments, Ivy League alcoholics, and political hacks could seek their fortunes, with little or no oversight from up north. After all, it's only Chinatown. This cavalier view of an entire people was most apparent in the choice of men sent to rule over them, the governors of Puerto Rico, appointed by the President of the United States. Charles Herbert Allen was the first civilian governor of Puerto Rico, 1900 to 1901. Though he never served in the armed forces, he loved to dress in military regalia and have people address him as Colonel. He arrived like a Roman conqueror with a naval cannon salute, the 11th United States Infantry Band, and hundreds of armed men. He marched through the heart of San Juan and into the governor's mansion. The mansion was gift-wrapped. Allen delivered his inaugural address behind the largest, most imperial flags that Puerto Ricans had ever seen. Allen had been a congressman, a U.S. Navy bureaucrat, and commissioner of prisons for Massachusetts. During his 1 year as governor, he developed a passion for business. It started the moment he set foot in Puerto Rico, on April 27, 1900. Within a matter of weeks, and with little consultation or oversight, Allen created a budget for the entire island. He raided the island treasury by raising property taxes, withholding municipal and agricultural loans, and freezing all building, repair, and school construction funds. He redirected the insular budget to subsidize U.S.-owned farm syndicates. He issued no-bid contracts for U.S. businessmen, and subsidized roads built by agents from his father's Massachusetts lumber business, at double the cost. Through his darkroom budget, Allen created new agencies, offices, and salary lines, all staffed by U.S. bureaucrats. By the time he left in 1901, nearly all 11 members of the governor's executive council were U.S. expatriates, and half the appointed offices in the government of Puerto Rico had gone to visiting Americans, 626 of them at top salaries. But Allen had a larger plan. It was hidden in plain sight, like the purloined letter, within his first annual report to U.S. President William McKinley. First, he wrote, "Puerto Rico is a beautiful island with its natural resources undeveloped, and its population unfitted to assume the management of their own affairs. The soil of this island is remarkably productive, as rich as the delta of the Mississippi or the valley of the Nile. With American capital and American energies, the labor of the natives can be utilized to the lasting benefit of all parties." Then Allen appealed to vanity and greed. The introduction of fresh blood is needed. And when the American capitalist realizes that there is a supply of labor accustomed to the tropics, and that the return to capital is exceedingly profitable, he will come here with his capital. Puerto Rico is really the rich gate to future wealth, by that indomitable thrift and industry which have always marked the pathway of the Anglo-Saxon. Finally, the governor got down to business. The yield of sugar per acre is greater than in any other country in the world. A large acreage of lands, which are now devoted to pasturage, could be devoted to the culture of sugarcane. Molasses and rum, the incidental products of sugarcane, are themselves sufficient to pay all expenses of the sugar planters, and leave the returns from his sugar as pure gain. The cost of sugar production is $10 per ton cheaper than in Java, $11 cheaper than in Hawaii, $12 cheaper than in Cuba, $17 cheaper than in Egypt, $19 cheaper than in the British West Indies, and $47 cheaper than in Louisiana and Texas. This was no mere first annual report to the president. It was a business plan for a sugar empire, and Allen quickly staked his claim. A few weeks after handing in this report, on September 15, 1901, Allen resigned as governor. He then headed straight to Wall Street, where he joined the House of Morgan as vice president of both the Morgan Trust Company and the Guarantee Trust Company of New York. He built the largest sugar syndicate in the world, and his hundreds of political appointees in Puerto Rico provided him with land grants, tax subsidies, water rights, railroad easements, foreclosure sales, and favorable tariffs. Charles Herbert Allen became the Green Pope. By 1907, his syndicate, the American Sugar Refining Company, owned or controlled 98% of the sugar processing capacity in the United States and was known as the Sugar Trust. By 1910, Allen was treasurer of the American Sugar Refining Company. By 1913, he was its president, and by 1915, he sat on its board of directors. Today, his company is known as Domino Sugar. As the first civilian governor of Puerto Rico, Charles Herbert Allen used his governorship to acquire an international sugar empire and a controlling interest in the entire Puerto Rican economy. No one stopped him. Why should they? It's only Chinatown. On November 20th, 1921, the steamer Tanamo lurched into New York Harbor, with several people screaming on board. A gangplank was hurried into place, and the governor of Puerto Rico ran out yelling, "There's a fire on the ship. They're trying to kill me." According to the governor, the fire had been caused by an infernal machine secreted in the bowels of the vessel by a Puerto Rican patriot, with the intention of sending his honor to the bottom of the sea. Some stevedores rushed aboard, and lo and behold, there was a fire in the ship's hold. She sank at the pier the very next day. It was tremendous news, making the front page of the New York Times. No one ever found the machine or the Puerto Rican, but in all fairness, the governor was not delusional. E. Montgomery Riley was the most hated man in Puerto Rico. In 4 short months, Riley had managed to insult virtually every politician, journalist, farmer, teacher, priest, and bootblack in Puerto Rico. Almost everyone wanted to eliminate him, if not from the world, at least from the island. His arrogance and contempt for Puerto Ricans hastened his downfall. On April 30th, 1921, President Warren G. Harding appointed Riley, a former assistant postmaster in Kansas City, governor of Puerto Rico as a political payoff. Riley took his oath of office in Kansas City, then attended to personal business for another 2.5 months, before finally showing up for work on July 30th. By that time, he had already announced to the island press that 1. He was the boss now. 2. The island must become a U.S. state. 3. Any Puerto Rican who opposed statehood was a professional agitator. 4. There were thousands of abandoned children in Puerto Rico. And 5. The governorship of Puerto Rico was the best appointment that President Harding could award, because its salary and perquisites would total $54,000 a year. Just a few hours after disembarking, the assistant postmaster marched into San Juan's Municipal Theater and uncorked one of the most reviled inaugural speeches in Puerto Rican history. He announced that there was no room on this island for any flag other than the Stars and Stripes. So long as Old Glory waves over the United States, it will continue to wave over Puerto Rico.
Listen.
He then pledged to fire anyone who lacked Americanism. He promised to make English the language of Washington, Lincoln, and Harding, the primary one in Puerto Rican schools. It already was. And he repeatedly referred to Puerto Rico as these islands. Reactions to Riley were prompt. La Democracia portrayed the speech as the ridiculous pose of a school teacher, of things he doesn't know about. He seems to think we're primitives. La Correspondencia agreed that Riley showed no knowledge of our manner of being. El Mundo noted Riley's hard and threatening tone. El Tiempo wrote that Riley intended to liquidate the Union Party. From that moment on, La Correspondencia lambasted Riley every week in both English and Spanish. La Democracia carried a series of open letters to Riley, some of them titled Letters to the Emperor and Darling Caesar. Riley himself stated, I received a number of letters threatening my life, others telling me to leave the island within 48 hours or else I would be killed, and that if I drove through the streets I would be murdered. In long, rambling letters to President Harding, he wrote that Puerto Ricans are children, that they could not be trusted, that every Puerto Rican professional politician carries a pistol, that his commissioner of immigration is a half-blooded Negro, the kind of man I cannot associate with, and that he had fired the treasurer of Puerto Rico because he lived all the time with a Negro woman. In order to maintain law and order among all these children, half-bloods and Negroes, Riley reinstated the death penalty in Puerto Rico. The month after Riley's boat caught fire, things heated up again. A succession of Puerto Rican leaders steamed up to Washington, D.C., demanding Riley's removal because he spent half his time outside Puerto Rico and had recruited 5 carpetbaggers into the highest and highest paid positions in his administration. These included John R. Hull, the governor's own nephew and private secretary, George S. McClure of Kansas City, the chief of the Puerto Rican Secret Service, William Kessinger of Kansas City, auditor, Kessinger's son, an inexperienced youth, assistant auditor, and a Mrs. Liggett of Kansas City, assistant commissioner of education. Riley had brought all of them down from Kansas City, and none of them had any knowledge of Spanish. When the U.S. Senate requested a record of Riley's appointments, he gave them an incomplete list showing none of these 5 individuals. He then omitted the entire list of appointments in his annual governor's report for fiscal year 1920 to 1921. The fiasco continued when, on April 7, 1922, a grand jury in San Juan brought formal charges of misuse of public funds for private purposes against Governor Riley, his secretary John Hull, and auditor William Kessinger. The 3 men had used the fiction that Puerto Rico owed the governor $5,000 to withdraw this amount from the insular treasury. When Riley realized the investigation was serious, he sent a personal check for $1,449.03 to the auditor's office, then fired San Juan District Attorney Ramon Diaz-Collazo to prevent him from filing the indictment. When the DA argued that he was being removed illegally, Riley had the police forcibly eject him. Then, when the grand jury report was handed to Salvador Mestre, Puerto Rico's Attorney General, Riley tried to get him fired as well. The vice president of the Puerto Rico House of Representatives, Alfonso Lastra Chiares, wrote, "If revolution does not come soon, we shall die of nausea at contact with so much filth. I accuse E. Mont Riley, the governor of Puerto Rico, and J.R. Hull, his private secretary, of obtaining money belonging to Puerto Rico for their own benefit, using criminal means. I accuse them of being thieves." Congressman Horace Mann Towner, chairman of the House Committee on Insular Affairs, wrote to President Harding that the grand jury's report and Riley's subsequent actions were most embarrassing. U.S. Secretary of War John W. Weeks forbade Riley from speaking publicly on political issues. A New York Times reporter wrote rumors of Riley's impending resignation. Another reporter wrote, "The governor chews gum. He is short, boldish, plump with a dimple. The boys who know him warn you to nail down the furniture." The entire island joined in the fun and dubbed Riley Moncho Reyes. Suckling pigs called Moncho Reyes were barbecued and devoured. Songs and plays about Moncho Reyes were performed throughout the island and caused great hilarity, because Moncho is Caribbean slang for congenital idiot. When an entire island is laughing at its colonial governor, it is safe to say that he has outlived his usefulness. It is impossible to subjugate people who are laughing at you.
We should hold that same standard to the presidents.
Tendered his letter of resignation on February 16, 1923. In less than 2 years' time, he'd gone from assistant postmaster to petty thief, caught with his hand in the till. This was the man the President of the United States had sent to govern Puerto Rico. The cigar, massive ring, waterproof oyster Rolex watch, and colorful shirt and tie combo said it all. He landed in Puerto Rico with all the bluster and showmanship of P.T. Barnum, and treated the island like a three-ring circus, and it all exploded in his face. He was forced to resign within 6 months. Born dirt poor in the backwoods of Kentucky, Robert Hayes Gore Sr.'s early fortune was built on a gimmick. While working at the Terre Haute Post, he began to offer traveler's insurance for 1 cent a week to the newspaper's subscribers. Within 1 year, by January 1922, he was selling that same life insurance through 132 daily newspapers, and his 20% commission exceeded $100,000 per year. In 2014 dollars, that would be $1.4 million. By 1930, Gore had purchased the Fort Lauderdale Daily News for $75,000, acquired newspapers in Daytona Beach and Deland, built a waterfront mansion, the old Anglers Club Hotel on Montana Avenue, and was developing Florida real estate. In his spare time, he wrote a children's fiction series called Wampus Cat and Renfro Horn, Young Adult Mysteries. Life for Gore was good. Then he entered politics. He gave $10,000 to Democratic Party leader James Farley and supported Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidential bid through his newspapers. In exchange, in August 1933, he received a convenient appointment. As governor of Puerto Rico, he could shuttle back and forth to his Florida properties and develop further business around the Caribbean basin. It was a crude but workable political fix. There was only one problem. Gore was a brilliant businessman, but one of the most inept governors in the history of Puerto Rico. The Nation reported, when he was appointed, Mr. Gore was not quite sure where Puerto Rico was. After a talk with him, it is clear that he is still confused on this point. Before taking office, he said to the president of Cuba, Gerardo Machado, of the anti-American sentiment and agitation there, unless you put an end to these outrageous goings-on here, the United States government will send an army to do the job for you. Machado telephoned President Roosevelt to inquire about this imminent invasion. In 1933, Gore went to the Chicago World's Fair and told the press that Puerto Rico should become a U.S. state. The Department of War sent him a furious telegram, reminding him that Puerto Rico is not even approximately prepared for statehood, and that statehood is a policy matter for the War Department, the President, and Congress. The whole point of naming an American as governor, not a Puerto Rican, was precisely to avoid this kind of political pitfall. FDR appointed Gore on April 29, 1933. Upon arriving in Puerto Rico on July 23rd, Gore announced his political program. He proposed an international cockfighting carnival in order to boost tourism. He wanted all disloyal teachers removed from the school system on grounds of treason. He wanted less Spanish in classrooms, and preferably none. He wanted Education Commissioner Jose Padin removed immediately because he was too pro-Puerto Rican. He wanted political appointees to provide him with an undated letter of resignation so that he could fire them at will. He wanted Puerto Rican workers to relocate to Florida, especially to Fort Lauderdale. He wanted Puerto Rico to produce large quantities of rum. He wanted to train nightingales to sing the Star-Spangled Banner and sell them in Texas for $50. The reaction to Gore's program was less than enthusiastic. 2,000 students paralyzed the University of Puerto Rico and marched to the governor's mansion carrying a casket, demanding his resignation. A bomb went off at the governor's summer home in Jajome Alto. 4 sticks of dynamite were found in the governor's mansion. La Democracia wrote, "Mr. Gore will disappear from Puerto Rico as a liar, for his incompetence, for his vindictiveness, for his fantasy, for being useless, for his ineptness, for his stupidity." And a Puerto Rican senator published an editorial titled, "Governor Gore, you are a damn liar." When an agricultural strike broke out in November 1933, Gore was utterly incapable of slowing it down. By January 1934, it had spread throughout the entire island. Alarmed U.S. corporations and sugar syndicates formed the Citizens Committee of 1,000 for the Preservation of Peace and Order, and cabled President Roosevelt that a state of actual anarchy exists. Towns in state of siege, police impotent, business paralyzed. Gore announced that someone was trying to poison his family and demanded that the FBI investigate all of his detractors, including senators, editors, students, labor leaders, sugarcane workers, and the chef in the governor's mansion. The request was declined, but the War Department sent the president of Dartmouth University, Dr. Ernest Hopkins, to make sense of the situation. Hopkins's report sealed Gore's fate. Robert Gore is probably the worst blunderer that ever came along. He has the genius for doing things wrong, and has a feeling of hostility or suspicion towards anybody not connected with the political group with which he is working. On January 12, 1934, President Roosevelt accepted Gore's resignation. He had lasted only 6 months and was physically and emotionally broken. But he did win one moral victory. Before he left the island, Gore uprooted the prized orchids from the inner patio of the governor's mansion, smuggled them back to Fort Lauderdale, and planted them around his house. While ex-Governor Gore was pulling out the orchids at the governor's mansion, President Roosevelt was pulling out his hair over Puerto Rico. A new labor union, the Asociación de Trabajadores de Puerto Rico, Workers' Association of Puerto Rico, was demanding 12 cents an hour for its workers. The island-wide agricultural strike wasn't slowing down. The Citizens Committee of 1,000 for the Preservation of Peace and Order was in a panic, sending endless telegrams to Roosevelt about paralyzed business and exploding anarchy. Despite his New Deal program of relief, recovery, and reform, Roosevelt took a different approach to Puerto Rico. Roosevelt listened to the Citizens Committee and the people clamoring for a strong governor, a military man who could straighten things out in Puerto Rico. To restore law and order, he appointed General Blanton Winship, a retired Army general from Macon, Georgia. Unfortunately, in the words of one Puerto Rican senator, Winship was the most disastrous governor that Puerto Rico has had in this century. Winship's 2 primary legislative proposals were to plant gardens throughout Puerto Rico and to reinstate the death penalty. The latter went nowhere. Capital punishment was abolished in 1929 and never reinstated. From the moment he arrived, General Winship proceeded to militarize the entire island. He urged the building of a $4 million naval air base, the cost of which ultimately ballooned to over $112.5 million. He created new, vigorous police training camps and spent his weekends touring them, along with every U.S. military installation. He also added hundreds of men to the insular police force, equipping every unit with machine guns, tear gas, and riot gear, and painted their cars a suggestive new color, blood red. Winship also conveyed power and authority through the adroit use of police uniforms, which resembled those of World War II military officers. The man FDR sent to solve the Puerto Rican problem was uninformed about economics and legislative procedure, but he clearly understood power, force, and fear. The general's solution was similar to Jonathan Swift's in A Modest Proposal. To cure the Irish problem, Englishmen should eat Irish children, preferably with succulent sauces, as the tots were rather bony. General Winship was not sent to Puerto Rico to negotiate. He was sent to crush labor strikes, subdue nationalists, and kill them if necessary. It didn't take long before he did just that. The Rio Piedras Massacre. On October 24th, 1935, University of Puerto Rico students held a meeting to discuss their relationship with Pedro Albizu Campos and the Nationalist Party. To ensure a peaceful gathering, General Winship's police surrounded the campus in Rio Piedras and stationed themselves on every street corner with carbines, tear gas, and machine guns. At 10:30 a.m., before the meeting started, several police cars intercepted a Willis 77 sedan, license plate 6268, with 4 nationalists inside. 2 policemen jumped onto the running boards and ordered the driver to proceed slowly to a nearby police station.
My bad, guys, but I'm gonna have to put the air back on because somebody's outside with their music bumping. I don't want TikTok to be able to violate me or YouTube to be able to violate me. So if you hear the little air in the background like I had it a few minutes ago, it's because somebody's outside bumping some music.
1 block from the station, on Calle Arzuaga, several more police cars pulled up. A squad of officers surrounded the car, and all of them started shooting. A cadet of the Republic named Jose Santiago Barrea ran toward the car and was killed instantly. 3 nationalists, Ramon Espagan, Pedro Quiñones, and Eduardo Rodriguez, were gunned down inside the vehicle. An old man named Juan Muñoz Jimenez was also shot and killed. Jimenez wasn't a nationalist. He was out buying a lottery ticket. The entire island was outraged. Speaking to 8,000 mourners, Albizu Campos accused General Winship and his chief of police, Colonel E. Francis Riggs, of deliberately murdering the nationalist representatives of Puerto Rico. Since Ramon Espagan had been treasurer of the Nationalist Party and had recently exposed a plot to assassinate Albizu Campos, this was no hyperbole. 4 days after the massacre, Police Chief Riggs stated in several major newspapers that he was ready to wage war to the death against all Puerto Ricans. On the quiet Sunday morning of February 23, 1936, Riggs got his war. As a Yale-educated gentleman, member of the Scroll and Key, and heir to the Riggs National Bank fortune, perhaps he felt invulnerable. But after engineering the Rio Piedras Massacre, he was ripe for retaliation. As he returned home to the El Escambron luxury resort, 2 young men approached. Hiram Rosado shot and missed. Elias Beauchamp killed him instantly. The police arrested Rosado and Beauchamp, took them to the San Juan District Station, and summarily executed them within an hour. General Winship took immediate personal command of all insular police. Later that evening, 2 more nationalists, Angel Mario Martinez and Pedro Crespo, were shot and killed by police in the town of Utuado. Other nationalists disappeared and were never heard from again. These became known as Los Desaparecidos. The next day, thousands of mourners from all over the island flocked to San Juan in a massive outpouring of grief and support. Winship tried to stop the marchers, but there were simply too many of them. El Imparcial ran a story, and the headline read, "Go ahead and shoot. Then you'll see how a man dies. Disparen para que vean como muere un hombre." At the funeral services for Rosado and Beauchamp, Albizu Campos declared, "The murder at Rio Piedras was his work. General Blanton Winship, who occupies La Fortaleza. Cold-blooded murder, to perpetuate murder as a method of government, is being carried out by the entire police force." General Winship countered with his own front-page funeral for Police Chief Riggs. One of the pallbearers, Police Captain Guillermo Soldevilla, would later lead the police slaughter at the Ponce Massacre. Police raids. After the assassination of Police Chief Riggs and the 4 nationalists, General Winship unleashed a reign of terror across the island. The day after the bodies were buried, on February 25th, he repeated his call for capital punishment in Puerto Rico. He even convened a press conference to promote this demand, announcing, "I have recommended the passage of a death penalty to the legislature of Puerto Rico. This is absolutely necessary in order to combat the wave of criminality on this island. I will enforce law and order in Puerto Rico no matter what the cost." The next day, on February 26th,
Yeah, that quote, law and order, sounds familiar. Like, who I heard use that recently? In the last couple of years, who's been spewing that law and order shit lately?
those same newspapers showed full-page photos of bloody clothes recovered from the corpse of Elias Beauchamp. As a lifetime military man, Winship moved forward in the only way he knew how. He hired more insular police and instructed them to raid nationalist homes and offices and to arrest nationalists throughout the island.
I'll give you a hint. It's someone who's promising to give police officers full autonomy.
Campos received death threats and relocated to the town of Aguas Buenas, where he posted a round-the-clock guard that repelled 4 assaults by police and FBI agents. Eventually, documents and recordings of Albizu's speeches were seized by the insular police and submitted to a federal grand jury.
Listen up.
Winship's policemen, National Guardsmen, undercover detectives, FBI agents, military intelligence personnel, and several attack dogs packed the Jose Toledo Federal Building when Albizu and 6 nationalists were convicted of conspiracy to overthrow the U.S. government. Officers with blackjacks, tear gas, rifles, and Thompson submachine guns barricaded entire sections of San Juan.
We got 8 minutes left of this chapter, guys. 8 minutes left. Let's end this chapter out with a bang. Let's tap the screen. Let's hit the heart emojis in the comment section below. Let's keep it going, guys. We got 8 minutes left of this chapter.
General Winship got what he wanted that day. The conviction of
Yeah, that goes for everybody watching on YouTube, too. Come on, let's hit those heart emojis, guys.
And his removal from the island. With the nationalist leadership safely behind bars, Winship grew bolder. He prohibited all public demonstrations, including speeches at funerals. At his discretion and without notice, Winship would declare martial law in random areas. The police would lay siege to those areas, conduct warrantless searches, break into people's homes.
Martial law in Puerto Rico? Say it ain't so.
And other residents from entering or leaving the zone. Despite this police repression, or perhaps because of it, groups of students began to lower the American flag at public schools and to raise the Puerto Rican flag instead. At the Central High School in San Juan, the police arrested 4 students standing guard over their island's flag. President Roosevelt had gotten his expected result: the complete militarization of Puerto Rico and the establishment of a police state that could control the population. Then came the Ponce Massacre. The Ponce Massacre. The Ponce Massacre, the defining event in Blanton Winship's brutal administration, is described in Chapter 7, but it deserves one final review. When the insular police gunned down 17 men, women, and children on Palm Sunday, they were acting under the orders of Police Chief Enrique de Orbeta, who reported directly to Governor Winship. They were acting under the orders of Police Chief Enrique de Orbeta, who reported directly to Governor Winship. By prearranged placement, Orbeta's policemen completely surrounded the unarmed civilians before the shooting began. This was not riot control or crowd management. Rather, the officers had set up a killing zone.
My bad about the AC noise is that I was trying to drown out whatever car was parked in front of the house, blasting their music. Again, I'm live on YouTube, guys, so if you guys want to be able to catch the episode or this full segment from the beginning, because we are on chapter, it says 9 Audible, but it's really chapter 8 because they considered the introduction as a chapter that kind of throws it off. But if you want to catch from chapter 1 up to chapter 8, please, later on tonight, you'll be able to catch it. We have 5 minutes and 52 seconds left of the Audible, so please do me a favor. Let's end it out with a bang. Let's tap the screen, share this live, and let's keep it going.
Lethal tactics, manpower, and weaponry, with hundreds of innocents forced into the crossfire. The man who led the operation, Captain Guillermo Soldevilla, had been a pallbearer at the funeral of E. Francis Riggs, the slain police chief of Puerto Rico.
Yo, listen, after reading this book, I'm going to be honest, every individual that I came across and said they've read this book, they all say the same thing. They're angry, they're mad, and this, that, and the third, and how could Puerto Ricans still want to be a part of something that does nothing but want to exploit, right? And my answer to that is, yo, assimilation is crazy. Indoctrination is crazy. A lot of our people, believe it or not, have Stockholm Syndrome. And they really believe the abuser is going to be their savior. And it sucks to say it like that, but that's the reality of our situation as Boricua. We're so divided. But it's because of the psyche aspect of it. We went from one colonizer to another, never been given the opportunity to have our own autonomy, to be able to govern ourselves or even participate in any real governance among our own people. And it's not the same when you have somebody else elected and then another government controls that government and also leads the way for these individuals to even take seat and take office, for them to be able to manipulate them. So like I said, there's so many aspects to this, and Stockholm Syndrome's real. It's a motherfucker, excuse my French, but yeah, it's real, guys.
To add insult to injury, Winship then tried to frame the victims, forcing the Ponce district attorney to create false evidence and testimony so that the nationalists could be imprisoned for murdering themselves. If it weren't for one photograph, which enabled the Hayes Commission to see what had actually happened, Winship would have gotten away with it. A time to celebrate. Even though the Hayes Commission exposed the Palm Sunday murder of Puerto Rican civilians, FDR did not immediately evict Winship from the governor's mansion.
Thanks for the gifts.
President Roosevelt had fired the last governor. To fire 2 in a row would be a blatant admission that U.S. colonial policy was failing in Puerto Rico. And so the general stayed on, chasing nationalists around the island, building FBI files against them, and visiting his military installations.
Thanks for the follow.
1 year after the Ponce Massacre, however, he pushed the island too far. The United States had first landed in Puerto Rico on July 25th, 1898. General Winship decided to celebrate the 40th anniversary with a massive military demonstration. But instead of doing it in Guanica, the town...
Yo, really quick, guys, don't forget to go follow me on YouTube. I'm live right now on YouTube, so if you guys missed the rest of the live, you guys can actually go back and go watch the rest of the live later on. But we have 4 minutes and 16 seconds. I will stop pausing it until this is done.
Invasion occurred. He decided to celebrate it in Ponce, the town that had suffered the massacre. The reviewing stand was in Plaza de Gateau, just 2 blocks from the site of the massacre, where bullet holes still pockmarked the battered walls. Winship chose this celebration site to send a message to Puerto Ricans, regardless of the personal anguish it might cause. On July 25th, 1938, U.S. Navy cruisers steamed into the port of Ponce, filled with landing forces that marched into the town. Air Force planes maneuvered over the town. U.S. infantry paraded past the Plaza de Gateau Rotunda, where American military officers and police bodyguards stuffed the reviewing stand. In the middle of the festivities, a nationalist student, Angel Esteban Anton Giorgi, ran up to the platform and fired on General Winship. A National Guardsman leapt in and took a direct hit. He died immediately, but prevented the assassination. Anton Giorgi was shot down. His body was hastily removed, and the corpse was never seen again. Despite the assassination attempt, General Winship clung to his governorship for nearly a year, with President Roosevelt looking the other way. Finally, on May 11th, 1939, Congressman Vito Marcantonio shouted a speech on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives, listing in great detail the tyrannical acts of the governor in depriving the people of Puerto Rico of their civil rights, the corruption and rackets that existed and were made possible only by the indulgence of the governor, and the extraordinary waste of the people's money. The next day, FDR removed Winship from the governorship of Puerto Rico. A parting gift to the island. Immediately after leaving the governor's mansion, Winship became a lobbyist for the U.S. corporations and sugar syndicates that owned the economy of Puerto Rico. His job was to persuade the U.S. Congress to exempt Puerto Rico from the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act. He was performing brilliantly, until Congressman Marcantonio fired another fusillade on the floor of the U.S. House. In keeping with his 5 years of terror in Puerto Rico, he acted the part of the slimy lobbyist, and fought by means fair and foul to have the wage and hour law amended so that the sugar companies could pay 12.5 cents instead of 25 cents an hour, and thereby gain $5 million a year, so that the system of abysmal wage slavery could be perpetuated in Puerto Rico. Up to the very closing days of Congress, this kicked-out governor fought to have Puerto Rican workers removed from the protection of the wage and hour law. Winship was defeated. The workers got their 25 cents per hour. Because they worked under brutal conditions, this was eminently fair. It was additionally so because in the years that followed, 62,000 of these workers would serve in World War II, and another 43,000 would serve in the Korean War. They fought in the front lines, with Winship safely in the rear. The general was never indicted for his deadly actions in Puerto Rico. He was given a comfortable command during World War II, and finished his career as the oldest active soldier in the U.S. military. He even prosecuted Nazi war criminals at the Nuremberg trials for their crimes against humanity.
Thank you for the subscription.
The hypocrisy of this final assignment was a fitting coda to the symphony of sleaze and slaughter that the United States bestowed on Puerto Rico in the name of good government. Winship was walking tall, waving documents, pointing fingers, trying others for their atrocities. His own crimes had been committed in Puerto Rico, and therefore they didn't count. After all, it's only Chinatown.
This was deep, guys. This was deep. Because again, like Nelson Dennis said, you know, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happened in Puerto Rico never happened at all. You know, and that shit resonates so much. Yeah, I really appreciate everybody tapping in. Again, we're still live on YouTube right now. So if you guys missed the rest of the book, or you guys want to go back and listen from the beginning, we went from the introduction all the way. We made it up to chapter 9, I believe. So if you guys want to be able to go back and go listen, do me a favor, go check out YouTube. We're still live as we speak. We got a couple of people in there. Yo, salute to everybody on YouTube. Appreciate all the love and support. This is my first time live on YouTube, so I'm trying to get the hang of it. And I'm trying to get the hang of looking at both things at one time. Because I got my phone up here and I got the iPad here, but tomorrow I might switch. I don't know. We'll get there when we get there. The point is that we started something to be able to archive these books, so that way you guys can go back and go listen to it. And it's not just listening to the book, it's also listening to other people's perspective and interjecting in certain parts of these different books. So I really appreciate everybody tapping in. Don't forget, go check out the YouTube. Don't forget, we are going back to Yabucoa, Puerto Rico for the Young Lords Back to Borinquen project. We will be in Yabucoa, Puerto Rico from October 6th to the 15th. We will be at the Marco Sanchez Community Center. Marco Sanchez Community Center was a school that was lacking resources and funds, that was forced to close down, that the community took over to be able to implement not just emergency services, but also community gatherings. So if you guys want to go check out the Marco Sanchez Community Center, don't just look at my GoFundMe. Go Google them, look them up, see how you can go help them personally if that's what you want to do. But we will be down there. We do have a GoFundMe. The link is in the bio on TikTok. I gotta put it on YouTube though, so that way you guys can be able to help me out too. But with all that said and done, I'm gonna catch you guys later on. I can't play the music like I normally do unless I end it here, but I'm gonna just end it out because I got a couple of things I gotta do. I'm gonna catch you guys tomorrow with part 2. Peace, blessings, and positivity. I'm gonna end it on YouTube first. Boom.